The Hittite Empire emerged as one of the most formidable and influential powers of the ancient Near East during the Late Bronze Age, rising from the rugged highlands of central Anatolia to dominate a vast region that connected Mesopotamia, the Levant, and the Aegean world, and its story begins with a fusion of indigenous Anatolian traditions and Indo-European influences that gradually shaped a unique political, military, and cultural system. Long before the Hittites became an empire, Anatolia was home to the Hutti people, whose name would later be adopted by the Hittites themselves, even though the Hittite language belonged to an Indo-European family distinct from the non-Indo-European tongue of the earlier Hutti. Around the early 2nd millennium BCE, Indo-European-speaking groups migrated into Anatolia and established small city-states such as Kusara and Kanesh, where Assyrian merchants operated extensive trade colonies that introduced writing, accounting systems, and far-reaching commercial networks. These early interactions played a crucial role in the formation of Hittite civilization, as the use of cuneiform writing and bureaucratic record-keeping became essential tools of governance. The transformation from scattered city-states into a centralized kingdom is traditionally associated with kings like Labarna and Hattusili I, who established Hattusa as the capital, a strategically positioned and heavily fortified city that symbolized the emerging power of the Hittite state. From this stronghold, the Hittite kings launched campaigns that expanded their influence across Anatolia and into northern Syria, bringing them into direct contact and frequent conflict with other major powers such as Mitanni, Assyria, and Egypt. The Hittite political system was notable for its balance between royal authority and aristocratic institutions, particularly the council known as the Panku, which could advise the king and, in earlier periods, even judge him, reflecting an unusually institutionalized form of governance for the ancient world. Succession, however, remained a persistent problem, with palace intrigues, assassinations, and usurpations threatening stability, prompting reforms under King Telepainu, whose edict sought to establish clear rules of inheritance and limit the cycle of violence that had plagued the royal house. Militarily, the Hittites distinguished themselves through their effective use of chariot warfare, disciplined infantry, and sophisticated logistical organization, allowing them to project power over long distances and maintain control over a diverse empire composed of vassal states bound by treaties. These treaties were among the most advanced diplomatic instruments of the ancient Near East, meticulously outlining obligations, tribute, mutual defense clauses, and divine witnesses, and they reveal a legalistic mindset that permeated Hittite political culture. Religion played a central role in legitimizing authority, as the Hittites famously described their land as having 1,000 gods, reflecting their practice of adopting and integrating deities from conquered regions into their pantheon rather than suppressing local cults. This religious inclusivity not only eased imperial administration but also reinforced the king's role as chief priest, responsible for maintaining harmony between the gods and the human realm. Economically, the Hittite state relied on agriculture, animal husbandry, and control of trade routes that linked the Black Sea, the Mediterranean, and Mesopotamia, while state-managed granaries and redistribution systems helped sustain armies and urban populations. The Hittites were also skilled metalworkers, benefiting from Anatolia's rich deposits of copper, silver, and iron, and although iron was initially rare and prestigious, Hittite experimentation with iron technology would later contribute to its wider diffusion after the collapse of the Bronze Age system. Culturally, the Hittites left behind an extraordinary archive of clay tablets from Hattusa, written in multiple languages including Hittite, Akkadian, Hurrian, and Luwian, which provide invaluable insight into their laws, myths, rituals, correspondence, and historical records. These texts reveal a society deeply concerned with order, oaths, and divine justice, as well as one that engaged creatively with the mythological traditions of Mesopotamia and the Levant, adapting stories such as the Epic of Gilgamesh and the Kumarbi cycle into their own religious framework. By the mid-2nd millennium BCE, under rulers like Suppiluliuma I, the Hittite Empire reached the height of its power, defeating Mitanni, asserting dominance over Syria, and becoming a central player in the international system of great powers that communicated through diplomacy, royal marriages, and gift exchange. This system, often referred to as the Club of Great Kings, placed the Hittite ruler on equal footing with the pharaoh of Egypt and the kings of Babylon and Assyria, marking a remarkable achievement for a state that had risen from relative obscurity. Yet the very complexity that enabled the Hittite Empire to flourish also made it vulnerable, as maintaining control over distant territories required constant military presence, careful diplomacy, and a stable internal order. The foundations laid in this formative period set the stage for both the grandeur and the fragility of the Hittite Empire, whose early development, administrative innovations, and cultural adaptability would leave a lasting legacy on the ancient Near East and prepare the ground for the dramatic events that would later define its zenith and eventual collapse. The mature phase of the Hittite Empire unfolded during the 14th and 13th centuries BCE, when the state evolved from a powerful Anatolian kingdom into a true imperial system that rivaled the greatest civilizations of the Late Bronze Age, and this period was defined by territorial expansion, complex diplomacy, internal reforms, and mounting external pressures that tested the resilience of Hittite rule. At the center of this transformation stood Suppiluliuma I, one of the most dynamic rulers in Hittite history, whose military brilliance and political calculation reshaped the balance of power in the Near East by dismantling the kingdom of Mitanni and extending Hittite authority deep into Syria. Through a combination of decisive campaigns and strategic treaties, Suppiluliuma replaced hostile regimes with loyal vassal kings, often drawn from his own family, thereby creating a network of dependent states that acknowledged Hittite supremacy while retaining local autonomy. This system allowed the empire to project power without direct annexation of every territory, but it also demanded constant vigilance, as rebellion remained a persistent threat. The Syrian cities of Carchemish, Aleppo, and Ugarit became vital nodes of Hittite influence, serving as administrative centers, military outposts, and hubs of international trade that linked Anatolia with the Mediterranean and Mesopotamia. Diplomacy during this era reached unprecedented sophistication, as the Hittites engaged in continuous correspondence with Egypt, Babylon, Assyria, and lesser kingdoms, exchanging letters, envoys, luxury goods, and royal brides in an effort to maintain equilibrium among competing powers. The most famous expression of Hittite diplomacy emerged after decades of rivalry with Egypt, culminating in the Battle of Kadesh during the reign of Muwatalli II, an enormous chariot engagement that, despite later Egyptian claims of victory, ended inconclusively and revealed the limitations of military force in resolving imperial competition. The aftermath of this conflict led to a historic peace treaty under Hattusili III and Ramses II, a document preserved in both Hittite and Egyptian versions, which established mutual non-aggression, extradition clauses, and dynastic alliance through marriage, and it stands as the earliest known surviving international peace treaty in human history. Internally, the empire during this period was marked by administrative consolidation and legal refinement, as kings sought to strengthen central authority while managing the ambitions of nobles and regional governors. Hattusili III's rise to power itself illustrated the fragile nature of succession, as he seized the throne from his nephew and justified his rule through divine favor and legal argumentation recorded in official texts, demonstrating how ideology and law were used to legitimize political realities. The Hittite legal system, though rooted in earlier traditions, showed a notable emphasis on compensation over harsh corporal punishment, reflecting a pragmatic approach to social order that balanced justice with economic stability. Religion continued to serve as the ideological backbone of the empire, with kings and queens acting as chief mediators between the gods and the people, and royal women such as Pujahipa playing exceptionally influential roles in both religious and diplomatic affairs, corresponding directly with foreign rulers and participating in treaty negotiations. The integration of Hurrian religious elements became particularly prominent, enriching Hittite ritual life and reinforcing the empire's multicultural character, while massive festivals and ceremonies at Hattusa symbolized cosmic order and imperial unity. Economically, the late Hittite Empire depended on an intricate system of agricultural production, taxation, and redistribution, yet it was increasingly strained by environmental challenges, including periods of drought that threatened food security and forced the state to import grain from Egypt and other regions. These economic vulnerabilities exposed the empire to instability, as shortages undermined royal authority and fueled unrest among both subjects and vassals. Meanwhile, Assyria's resurgence to the east introduced a formidable new rival, as Assyrian kings expanded aggressively into former Mitannian territories and challenged Hittite influence in northern Mesopotamia, leading to shifting alliances and sporadic warfare that drained resources. The Western Front posed its own difficulties, with the semi-independent lands of Arzawa and Walusa, often identified with the later legendary Troy, resisting firm integration and drawing the Hittites into prolonged struggles across Anatolia's rugged terrain. Maritime threats also emerged along the Mediterranean coast, as piracy and instability disrupted trade routes that were essential to the empire's prosperity. By the late 13th century BCE, under rulers such as Tudhaliya IV and Suppiluliuma II, the Hittite state was increasingly focused on survival rather than expansion, fortifying cities, reaffirming vassal treaties, and invoking divine protection through elaborate rituals intended to restore balance in a world perceived as slipping into disorder. The cumulative weight of military pressures, economic strain, internal dissent, and environmental stress gradually eroded the foundations of imperial control, even as the royal court continued to project an image of strength and legitimacy. This period of tension and adaptation revealed both the sophistication and the vulnerability of the Hittite imperial system, demonstrating how a state that had mastered diplomacy, law, and warfare could nonetheless be overwhelmed by interconnected crises beyond the capacity of any single ruler to resolve, setting the stage for the dramatic collapse of the Hittite Empire and the profound transformation of the Eastern Mediterranean world that would soon follow. The final phase of the Hittite Empire unfolded amid the sweeping upheavals of the late 13th and early 12th centuries BCE, when the interconnected world of the Eastern Mediterranean and Near East entered a period of systemic collapse that tested the limits of even the most resilient states, and for the Hittites this era marked a gradual but decisive unraveling of imperial authority. Under kings such as Tudhaliya IV and his son Suppiluliuma II, the Hittite court at Hattusa struggled to preserve stability in the face of mounting challenges that converged from multiple directions, including economic stress, environmental disruption, foreign invasion, and internal fragmentation. The empire's dependence on agricultural surplus made it acutely vulnerable to climatic fluctuations, and evidence from texts suggests repeated grain shortages and appeals for food aid from allies such as Egypt, revealing a level of strain that undermined both popular welfare and the state's ability to support armies and maintain loyalty among vassals. These material difficulties were compounded by political instability, as the authority of the central government weakened and local rulers and officials increasingly pursued their own interests, eroding the cohesion of the imperial system that had relied on constant oversight and ritual reaffirmation of loyalty. Externally, the Hittites faced relentless pressure from Assyria, which by this time had emerged as a highly militarized and expansionist power under kings like Tukulti-Ninurta I, pushing westward into territories that had once been firmly within the Hittite sphere and disrupting the delicate balance of power in northern Mesopotamia. To the west and northwest, unrest simmered among Anatolian populations and semi-independent regions, where long-standing resistance to Hittite control flared into open rebellion as central authority faltered. The coastal zones of Anatolia and Syria became increasingly unstable as maritime networks broke down, trade declined, and piracy intensified, further isolating the Hittite heartland from vital economic and diplomatic connections. Within this broader context of decline emerged the enigmatic phenomenon known as the Sea Peoples, groups whose precise origins remain debated but whose movements across the eastern Mediterranean are associated with the destruction or abandonment of major cities and the collapse of established states. Although the role of the Sea Peoples in the fall of the Hittite Empire remains complex and indirect, their attacks on coastal regions and disruption of trade routes exacerbated existing weaknesses and contributed to a climate of insecurity that the Hittite state was ill-equipped to manage. Suppiluliuma II attempted to respond through military campaigns, including naval engagements along the Mediterranean coast and renewed efforts to secure loyalty among remaining vassals, but these actions appear more defensive than transformative, reflecting a regime fighting to contain disintegration rather than to restore dominance. Archaeological evidence from Hattusa itself suggests a sudden and dramatic end, as the city was abandoned and partially destroyed, its monumental buildings left to ruin and its once vast archives buried beneath layers of debris, signaling the collapse of centralized administration and the disappearance of the royal court. Unlike some other ancient empires, the Hittite state did not transition smoothly into a successor kingdom within Anatolia. Instead, its political structures dissolved, leaving a fragmented landscape of small states and tribal groups that marked a profound break with the late Bronze Age order. Yet the end of the Hittite Empire did not mean the disappearance of Hittite culture or influence, for in northern Syria and southeastern Anatolia a series of Neo-Hittite or Syro-Hittite states emerged during the early Iron Age, preserving elements of Hittite language, religion, and artistic tradition while adapting to new political realities. These states, such as Carchemish, Melid, and Zinkerli, employed hieroglyphic Luwian inscriptions and monumental stone reliefs that depicted rulers, gods, and mythological scenes, providing a visual continuity that linked the memory of Hittite imperial grandeur to a transformed world. The legacy of the Hittites extended far beyond these regional survivals, as their legal concepts, treaty traditions, and diplomatic practices left a lasting imprint on Near Eastern political culture, influencing how later states conceptualized sovereignty, obligation, and international order. The famous peace treaty with Egypt, for example, became a model for subsequent diplomatic agreements, demonstrating that negotiated coexistence between great powers was both possible and desirable even in a competitive geopolitical environment. Linguistically, the decipherment of Hittite in the 20th century revolutionized the study of Indo-European languages, revealing that Hittite preserved archaic features that reshaped scholarly understanding of linguistic history and confirmed Anatolia as a crucial region in the early development of this language family. Religiously and mythologically, Hittite texts provided invaluable insight into the transmission and transformation of Near Eastern myths, showing how stories and rituals moved across cultural boundaries and were reshaped to serve new political and theological contexts. The fall of the Hittite Empire thus stands as a central episode in the broader Bronze Age collapse, illustrating how highly complex and interconnected systems can unravel when exposed to compounded stresses that exceed their capacity for adaptation. At the same time, the endurance of Hittite cultural elements in the centuries that followed highlights the distinction between the collapse of a state and the disappearance of a civilization, reminding us that ideas, traditions, and identities often outlive the political structures that first give them prominence. In this sense, the Hittites occupy a pivotal place in ancient history, not only as rulers of a powerful empire but also as contributors to enduring patterns of law, diplomacy, language, and cultural exchange that continued to shape the ancient world long after their imperial capital fell silent. The rediscovery and modern understanding of the Hittite Empire represent one of the most remarkable intellectual journeys in the study of ancient history, transforming a civilization once known only through fragmentary references in Egyptian and biblical texts into a richly documented and central actor in the story of the ancient Near East. For centuries after the fall of Hattusa, the Hittites faded from historical memory, their cities buried beneath Anatolian soil and their language entirely forgotten, leaving later civilizations with only vague recollections of a powerful northern kingdom that had once rivaled Egypt and Assyria. Classical authors occasionally mentioned a people called the Chalybes or Syrians of the north, but these references lacked clarity, and it was not until the 19th century that scholars began to suspect that the Hittites described in Near Eastern records corresponded to archaeological remains scattered across central Anatolia and northern Syria. Early travelers and archaeologists encountered massive stone ruins, city walls, and enigmatic reliefs carved with unfamiliar symbols, particularly at sites such as Bagaskoy, Yazilakaya, and Karchemish, yet the true identity of their builders remained uncertain. The breakthrough came with systematic excavations at Bagaskoy, identified as ancient Hattusa, where thousands of clay tablets were uncovered in the early 20th century, revealing an extensive royal archive written primarily in cuneiform script. The decipherment of these texts, especially after the recognition that the language recorded on many tablets was Indo-European, revolutionized ancient studies and confirmed that the Hittites were not a peripheral culture but one of the major powers of the Bronze Age world. This discovery reshaped scholarly understanding of political organization, diplomacy, and law in the second millennium BCE, as Hittite records provided unparalleled detail about treaties, royal correspondence, legal codes, and ritual practices, offering a level of internal documentation rarely matched by contemporary civilizations. Archaeology further illuminated the sophistication of Hittite urban planning, fortifications, and religious architecture, with Hattusa's massive gates, cyclopean walls, and sacred precincts demonstrating both technical skill and symbolic intent, while sites like Yazilakaya revealed open-air sanctuaries where processions of gods carved into rock expressed a cosmic vision of divine order aligned with royal authority. The artistic style of the Hittites, characterized by bold stone reliefs, stylized human and animal figures, and an emphasis on monumentality, reflected a culture deeply invested in projecting permanence and legitimacy, even as it absorbed influences from Hurrian, Mesopotamian, and Syrian traditions. Modern scholarship has also emphasized the Hittites' role as cultural mediators, situated at the crossroads of Anatolia, the Levant, and Mesopotamia, enabling them to transmit ideas, technologies, and myths across regions that might otherwise have remained more isolated. Their legal traditions, with their focus on compensation, proportionality, and contractual obligation, have attracted particular attention for revealing an alternative approach to justice distinct from the harsher punitive systems often associated with ancient law. In the realm of international relations, the Hittites are now recognized as pioneers of formal diplomacy, having developed standardized treaty formulas, oath rituals, and concepts of parity among great kings that laid the groundwork for later practices of interstate negotiation. The famous peace treaty with Egypt, preserved in both Akkadian and Egyptian versions, stands not merely as a historical curiosity but as evidence of a shared diplomatic culture that transcended linguistic and cultural boundaries. From a linguistic perspective, the study of Hittite and related Anatolian languages has profoundly influenced theories about the origins and early evolution of the Indo-European language family, as Hittite preserved archaic features that suggested a deeper and more complex prehistory than previously imagined. This linguistic legacy has positioned the Hittites as a key reference point in comparative philology, linking ancient Anatolia to a vast network of languages stretching across Europe and Asia. Beyond academia, the Hittites have increasingly entered public historical consciousness through museums, textbooks, and popular media, where they are presented as a compelling example of a civilization that combined military power with legal sophistication and cultural openness. Their story also resonates with modern reflections on the rise and fall of complex societies, as the collapse of the Hittite Empire illustrates how interconnected systems can fail under the cumulative weight of environmental stress, economic disruption, and geopolitical change. At the same time, the survival of Hittite cultural elements in Neo-Hittite states and their long-term influence on regional traditions challenge simplistic narratives of sudden disappearance, emphasizing continuity amid transformation. Today, ongoing excavations and advances in archaeological science continue to refine our understanding of Hittite chronology, economy, and daily life, revealing new details about everything from food production and textile manufacture to household religion and regional administration. As new tablets are deciphered and old interpretations revised, the Hittite Empire increasingly appears not as a rigid autocracy but as a dynamic and adaptive system capable of innovation and negotiation, even if ultimately unable to withstand the pressures of its age. In this broader perspective, the Hittites occupy a vital place in world history, not only as rulers of a powerful Bronze Age empire but also as contributors to enduring traditions of law, diplomacy, language, and cultural exchange that continue to inform how humanity understands its ancient past and the complex processes that shape civilizations over time. The Hittite Empire's significance becomes even clearer when examined through the lens of daily life, social organization, and the lived experiences of the people who inhabited its cities, towns, and rural landscapes, for it was not only kings, armies, and treaties that sustained the empire, but also farmers, artisans, scribes, priests, merchants, and soldiers whose collective labor and beliefs gave substance to imperial power. At the base of Hittite society stood the agrarian population, whose cultivation of wheat, barley, legumes, and flax formed the economic backbone of the state, while herding of cattle, sheep, and goats provided meat, dairy, wool, and hides essential to both subsistence and trade. The rhythms of agricultural life were closely tied to seasonal cycles and religious festivals, as rituals performed by priests and the royal family were believed to ensure favorable weather, fertility of the land, and divine protection against famine, reflecting a worldview in which human effort and divine favor were inseparably linked. Villages and farmsteads were organized around extended family units, with communal responsibilities for irrigation, storage, and defense, while surplus production was collected through taxation and redistributed to support temples, palaces, and military campaigns. Urban life in Hittite cities such as Hattusa, Sapinua, and Tarhuntassa presented a more complex social environment, where administrative officials, craftsmen, and religious personnel lived alongside soldiers and merchants in densely built quarters protected by massive walls and gates. Artisans specialized in pottery, metalworking, woodworking, textile production, and stone carving, and their skills were often regulated by the state, which controlled access to raw materials and commissioned goods for official use, including weapons, tools, ritual objects, and luxury items destined for elite consumption or diplomatic exchange. The presence of scribal schools within major urban centers underscores the importance of literacy and record-keeping in Hittite society, as scribes trained in multiple languages and scripts maintained archives of legal contracts, treaties, inventories, and ritual texts that enabled the empire to function as a coordinated administrative system. Social hierarchy was clearly defined yet not entirely rigid, with distinctions between free citizens, dependent workers, and slaves, though Hittite law provided specific protections and rights for each category, emphasizing compensation and legal process over arbitrary punishment. Women in Hittite society occupied a range of roles that extended beyond domestic life, as they could own property, participate in religious ceremonies, and, in the case of royal women, wield significant political and diplomatic influence, exemplified by queens such as Pujahipa, whose correspondence and legal authority attest to an unusually prominent female presence within the structures of power. Religion permeated every aspect of daily existence, shaping personal identity and communal cohesion through household rituals, local cults, and grand state festivals that reaffirmed the cosmic order and the legitimacy of the ruling dynasty. Temples served not only as sacred spaces but also as economic centers that owned land, employed workers, and managed resources, while priests and priestesses acted as intermediaries between the human and divine realms, interpreting omens, conducting sacrifices, and preserving ritual knowledge. The Hittite pantheon, drawn from a wide array of Anatolian, Hurrian, and Mesopotamian traditions, reflected the empire's multicultural character, allowing local communities to maintain familiar religious practices within an overarching imperial framework. Military service represented another central dimension of Hittite life, as both professional soldiers and conscripted laborers were required to support campaigns through fighting, construction, and logistics, and successful service could bring social advancement, land grants, or royal favor. The constant movement of armies and officials across the empire facilitated cultural exchange, spreading styles of dress, artistic motifs, and technological knowledge while also imposing the demands of imperial authority on distant regions. Trade networks connected Hittite lands to the Aegean, the Levant, and Mesopotamia, enabling the circulation of metals, textiles, ceramics, and luxury goods, and merchants operated under legal frameworks that regulated contracts, debts, and partnerships, highlighting the integration of commerce into the broader legal order. Despite these structures, life in the Hittite Empire was not free from hardship, as drought, disease, warfare, and political instability could disrupt communities and force individuals into dependency or displacement, conditions that become increasingly visible in the final centuries of the empire. Yet even amid uncertainty, the cultural resilience of Hittite society is evident in the continuity of rituals, legal practices, and artistic traditions that persisted beyond the collapse of central authority. The everyday experiences of Hittite subjects thus reveal an empire sustained not merely by conquest and diplomacy, but by complex social relationships, shared beliefs, and adaptive institutions that enabled diverse populations to coexist within a single political framework. By examining the Hittites at this human scale, their civilization emerges not as a distant abstraction of monuments and kings, but as a living society whose successes and struggles offer enduring insights into how ancient empires functioned, endured, and ultimately transformed, leaving traces that continued to shape the cultural landscape of Anatolia and the Near East long after the imperial capital had fallen silent. The Hittite Empire can also be understood most clearly by examining its military organization, strategic thinking, and the broader geopolitical environment in which it operated, for warfare and defense were not episodic events but constant conditions that shaped the empire's institutions, economy, and worldview. Unlike many ancient states that relied primarily on seasonal levies, the Hittites developed a flexible military system combining a standing core of trained warriors with large numbers of conscripts drawn from subject populations, enabling them to respond rapidly to threats while sustaining long campaigns far from the Anatolian heartland. Central to Hittite military power was the chariot, a light and maneuverable vehicle crewed by multiple warriors, which functioned not merely as a shock weapon but as a mobile platform for archers and spear fighters who could disrupt enemy formations and exploit terrain. Hittite chariotry differed from Egyptian models by emphasizing heavier crews and coordinated tactics, reflecting a doctrine focused on sustained engagement rather than ceremonial display. Infantry forces, often overlooked in earlier scholarship, formed the backbone of Hittite armies, equipped with spears, shields, swords, and protective gear, and supported by engineers, scouts, and supply personnel whose labor was essential to maintaining momentum in hostile environments. Military campaigns were carefully planned around logistics, with roads, depots, and water sources mapped and secured in advance, underscoring the administrative sophistication required to project power across mountains, plains, and river valleys. The king functioned as supreme commander, but authority was delegated to trusted generals and regional governors, creating a hierarchy that balanced centralized control with operational flexibility. Warfare, however, was inseparable from diplomacy, as Hittite strategy emphasized the use of treaties, alliances, and vassal relationships to reduce the need for constant conquest and to stabilize borders through negotiated obligation rather than perpetual force. Vassal states were required to provide troops, supplies, and intelligence, effectively extending the empire's military reach while binding local elites to the Hittite system through oaths sworn before the gods. These oaths carried immense religious weight, and the fear of divine punishment for betrayal was deliberately cultivated as a deterrent, illustrating how belief functioned as a strategic asset alongside weapons and fortifications. Defensive architecture further reveals the militarized nature of Hittite society, as cities like Hattusa were encircled by massive walls, gates, and towers designed not only to repel attackers but to project an image of invincibility that reinforced psychological dominance. Border regions were fortified with garrisons and watchtowers, and frontier zones functioned as buffers where diplomacy, trade, and conflict intersected in fluid and often volatile ways. The empire's geopolitical position placed it in continual contact with rival powers whose ambitions and capabilities evolved over time, requiring constant adaptation in both military and diplomatic policy. Relations with Egypt oscillated between rivalry and cooperation, culminating in a balance of power that recognized mutual limits, while interactions with Assyria grew increasingly antagonistic as Assyrian kings adopted a more aggressive and expansionist posture. To the west, the fragmented political landscape of Anatolia posed a different challenge, as loosely organized polities and shifting alliances resisted permanent integration and forced the Hittites into repeated campaigns that drained resources without yielding lasting security. The sea, once a conduit for trade and communication, gradually became a zone of uncertainty, as maritime instability disrupted supply lines and exposed coastal territories to attack, highlighting the empire's relative weakness in naval power compared to its land-based strengths. Military service left a deep imprint on Hittite culture and law, shaping concepts of loyalty, honor, and obligation that extended beyond the battlefield into civilian life. Legal texts address issues such as desertion, failure to perform duties, and the treatment of prisoners, reflecting an attempt to regulate violence and incorporate it into a moral and legal framework that upheld order even amid conflict. War captives were often resettled within the empire as laborers or dependents, contributing to economic production while also altering the demographic and cultural composition of communities, a process that reinforced imperial integration but also carried the risk of unrest. Rituals accompanied every major military undertaking, from divination before campaigns to purification ceremonies after battle, revealing a belief that success depended as much on divine favor as on human skill. Defeat, conversely, was interpreted as a sign of cosmic imbalance or ritual failure, prompting renewed religious activity rather than purely tactical reassessment. This fusion of military practice, legal regulation, and religious ideology created a distinctive Hittite approach to power, one that sought stability through order, obligation, and negotiated hierarchy rather than through unchecked domination. Yet this system, effective for centuries, contained inherent vulnerabilities, as it depended on continuous enforcement, reliable communication, and shared belief in the legitimacy of Hittite authority, all of which could erode under sustained pressure. When environmental stress, economic disruption, and external aggression converged in the Late Bronze Age, the finely balanced machinery of Hittite military and diplomatic power proved unable to adapt quickly enough to prevent collapse. Nevertheless, the Hittite experience offers a compelling case study in how ancient empires managed violence and cooperation on a grand scale, revealing a world in which war was not merely destruction but a regulated and deeply integrated aspect of political life. Through their armies, treaties, and strategic choices, the Hittites helped define the rules of power in the ancient Near East, leaving behind a legacy that continues to inform modern understanding of how complex states defend themselves, negotiate survival, and ultimately confront the limits of their own systems. The intellectual and religious world of the Hittite Empire reveals a civilization deeply committed to understanding order, causality, and the relationship between human society and the divine, and this worldview shaped not only ritual life but also law, governance, and historical memory. At the heart of Hittite belief was the conviction that the universe operated according to a fragile balance maintained through correct ritual practice, ethical conduct, and respect for divine authority, and when calamity struck in the form of plague, famine, or military defeat, it was interpreted not as random misfortune but as a sign that this balance had been disturbed. The gods of the Hittites formed an extraordinarily diverse pantheon drawn from Anatolian, Hattite, Hurrian, Mesopotamian, and Syrian traditions, resulting in what the Hittites themselves described as the land of 1,000 gods, a phrase that captured both religious inclusivity and the administrative challenge of managing countless local cults within a single imperial framework. Chief among these deities was the storm god, associated with weather, fertility, and royal power, whose favor was essential for agricultural prosperity and military success, while goddesses such as the sun goddess of Irina embodied justice, legitimacy, and cosmic order, reinforcing the moral dimension of kingship. Rather than suppressing local religions, the Hittites incorporated them into state cults, often translating rituals and hymns into multiple languages and preserving them in archives, an approach that reflected both theological pragmatism and political strategy. Ritual texts reveal an intense concern with precision, as ceremonies were meticulously prescribed, including specific offerings, gestures, spoken formulas, and even the correct emotional disposition of participants, for any deviation was believed to risk divine displeasure. Magic and ritual purification played a significant role in addressing impurity, illness, and social conflict, with specialized practitioners performing elaborate ceremonies to remove curses, cleanse pollution, and restore harmony between individuals, communities, and the gods. The intellectual foundations of this religious system are visible in Hittite myths, many of which were adapted from Hurrian and Mesopotamian sources yet reinterpreted to reflect Hittite values, such as the Kumarbi cycle, which explored themes of succession, rebellion, and legitimacy among the gods in ways that resonated with human political experience. These myths were not merely stories but explanatory frameworks that linked divine history to contemporary events, providing meaning and reassurance in times of crisis. Closely connected to religion was the Hittite legal tradition, which viewed law as an extension of cosmic order rather than a purely human invention, and legal texts frequently invoke the gods as witnesses and guarantors of justice. Unlike some ancient legal systems that emphasized harsh retribution, Hittite law prioritized restitution, compensation, and reconciliation, reflecting a pragmatic understanding of social stability that sought to repair relationships rather than simply punish offenders. Oaths and treaties were infused with religious symbolism, binding parties through divine oversight and ritual sanction, and the fear of supernatural consequences for oath-breaking served as a powerful deterrent in both domestic and international contexts. The Hittites also displayed a strong historical consciousness, recording annals, decrees, and treaties with careful attention to causality and precedent, suggesting an emerging sense of historiography that linked past actions to present outcomes. Kings justified their decisions by referencing earlier agreements and divine commands, portraying themselves not as arbitrary rulers but as guardians of inherited order and tradition. Education and intellectual life were centered on scribal culture, where students learned multiple languages, scripts, and genres, enabling them to preserve and transmit knowledge across generations and regions. The coexistence of cuneiform and hieroglyphic scripts reflects a society comfortable with multiplicity and adaptation, while the sheer volume of preserved texts testifies to an enduring commitment to documentation and reflection. This intellectual richness extended to practical knowledge as well, including astronomy, medicine, and divination, disciplines that blended empirical observation with religious interpretation to guide decision-making in uncertain circumstances. Dreams, omens, and oracles were consulted at every level of society, from royal councils to household concerns, reinforcing the perception that the divine world actively communicated with humanity. Yet this intense reliance on ritual and interpretation also created vulnerability, as repeated disasters could undermine confidence in established practices and prompt anxious experimentation with new rituals and foreign gods, a pattern visible in the late empire's proliferation of ceremonies aimed at averting catastrophe. In this way, the religious and intellectual life of the Hittites mirrored the strengths and weaknesses of their political system, capable of integrating diverse traditions into a coherent worldview yet dependent on continuous maintenance of balance in a world increasingly subject to disruption. The Hittite legacy in this realm is profound, for their texts provide one of the clearest windows into how an ancient civilization conceptualized justice, knowledge, and the divine as interdependent forces shaping human history. Through their rituals, myths, laws, and records, the Hittites articulated a vision of the world in which order was neither automatic nor permanent but something that had to be actively sustained through collective effort, ethical responsibility, and respect for transcendent authority, a vision that continues to resonate as a timeless reflection on the fragility and responsibility inherent in complex societies. The long-term legacy of the Hittite Empire can best be appreciated by tracing how its political ideas, cultural patterns, and institutional practices continued to shape the ancient Near East long after the imperial center at Hattusa had fallen silent, for although the Hittite state collapsed, the conceptual frameworks it developed did not vanish but instead migrated, transformed, and endured across centuries and regions. In the aftermath of the Bronze Age collapse, the political vacuum left in Anatolia and northern Syria was filled by a mosaic of Neo-Hittite or Syro-Hittite states, small kingdoms that consciously drew upon Hittite traditions to legitimize their authority in a new and unstable world. These successor states preserved the memory of Hittite kingship through royal titles, religious imagery, and monumental art, carving reliefs and inscriptions that echoed imperial styles while adapting them to local identities and Iron Age realities. The continued use of hieroglyphic Luwian, descended from the administrative practices of the Hittite heartland, demonstrates how linguistic and bureaucratic continuity provided a bridge between the Bronze Age Empire and later regional polities. In these kingdoms, rulers presented themselves as mediators between gods and people, echoing the Hittite conception of sacred kingship, even as they navigated a geopolitical environment dominated by rising powers such as Assyria. Assyrian expansion ultimately absorbed or destroyed many of these Neo-Hittite states, yet even this process testifies to Hittite influence, for Assyrian kings adopted and adapted elements of Hittite diplomatic practice, treaty formulation, and administrative logic as they built their own empire. The Hittite emphasis on formalized treaties, clear hierarchies of obligation, and divine enforcement helped establish norms of interstate behavior that became standard across the Near East, shaping how power was negotiated and legitimized in subsequent centuries. In legal thought, the Hittite preference for restitution and proportionality resonated beyond their borders, contributing to a broader Near Eastern tradition that recognized law as a mechanism for maintaining social balance rather than merely imposing punishment. Culturally, Hittite myths and religious concepts continued to circulate, influencing the mythological traditions of neighboring societies and contributing to a shared symbolic vocabulary that linked Anatolia, Syria, and Mesopotamia. The storm god, central to Hittite religion, persisted as a dominant figure in regional cults, illustrating how divine identities could transcend political boundaries and adapt to new contexts while retaining core attributes. From a linguistic perspective, the rediscovery of Hittite in the modern era revealed its profound importance for understanding the origins of Indo-European languages, but even in antiquity, the Anatolian languages formed a substratum that influenced later tongues and place names, embedding traces of Hittite presence in the linguistic landscape of the region. Archaeologically, the Hittite legacy is visible in patterns of settlement, fortification, and urban planning that informed later construction practices, as well as in the continued use of sacred spaces that retained ritual significance long after the empire's demise. The endurance of these material and conceptual elements underscores the idea that empires shape the future not only through conquest but through the institutional habits and cultural assumptions they leave behind. Modern interpretations of the Hittite Empire have increasingly emphasized its role as a mediator civilization, one that connected disparate regions and traditions and demonstrated how diversity could be managed through law, ritual, and negotiated authority rather than through uniformity alone. This perspective challenges older narratives that viewed the Hittites primarily as warriors or imperial rivals of Egypt, instead highlighting their contributions to the evolution of governance, diplomacy, and cultural integration. The Hittite experience also offers a cautionary lesson about the limits of complexity, showing how systems that rely on constant coordination and surplus production can become fragile when confronted with environmental stress, economic disruption, and cascading political failure. Yet this fragility does not negate the creativity and resilience evident in the empire's adaptive strategies, from its inclusive religious policies to its sophisticated legal and diplomatic frameworks. In the broader sweep of world history, the Hittite Empire stands as an early experiment in managing a multicultural, multi-regional state through negotiated relationships rather than absolute domination, anticipating later imperial models while retaining distinctive features shaped by its Anatolian context. The survival of Hittite ideas in successor states, rival empires, and modern scholarship alike demonstrates that historical significance is not measured solely by longevity but by the capacity to generate enduring patterns of thought and practice. Through their laws, treaties, myths, and administrative innovations, the Hittites contributed to a shared Near Eastern heritage that influenced how power, justice, and the sacred were understood across generations. In reflecting on the Hittite legacy, one is reminded that civilizations do not truly disappear when their capitals fall or their dynasties end, for their influence persists in the institutions they inspire, the stories they transmit, and the questions they leave behind about how human societies organize authority, respond to crisis, and seek meaning in a complex and often unpredictable world. The Hittite Empire, when examined through the lens of international relations and its role in the broader Late Bronze Age world, emerges as a central actor in a complex system of diplomacy, alliance, and conflict that defined the Eastern Mediterranean and Near East, revealing the sophistication with which a regional power could project influence far beyond its own borders. From its earliest expansion into northern Syria and Anatolia, the Hittite state cultivated a network of vassal kingdoms and client cities, carefully balancing coercion with negotiation to maintain authority over territories that were culturally diverse and geographically dispersed. This system relied on formalized treaties, oaths sworn before gods, and periodic reaffirmation of loyalty, practices that allowed Hittite rulers to extend power without direct annexation while ensuring that rebellion carried both political and religious consequences. Hittite kings corresponded regularly with contemporary rulers, including those of Egypt, Assyria, Babylonia, and Mitanni, exchanging letters that conveyed diplomatic nuance, legal stipulations, and requests for marital alliances, gifts, or military cooperation. The correspondence demonstrates an early form of what modern scholars might term international law, wherein mutual recognition and obligation were codified in writing and reinforced by religious authority, illustrating a keen awareness of reputation, precedent, and balance of power. Among the most dramatic episodes of Hittite diplomacy was the protracted rivalry with Egypt, culminating in the famed Battle of Kadesh under Muwatalli II, which, though tactically inconclusive, became a catalyst for long-term negotiation and treaty-making. The subsequent peace agreement between Hattusili III and Ramses II established not only cessation of hostilities but also mutual defense clauses, formalized extradition, and dynastic marriage alliances, marking the earliest surviving example of an international peace treaty and highlighting the Hittites' capacity for both pragmatism and strategic vision. These interactions reveal that military power alone was insufficient for managing complex relationships and that the projection of influence depended equally on persuasion, ritual legitimacy, and the careful management of symbolic authority. Hittite foreign policy also had to contend with shifting regional dynamics, such as the resurgence of Assyria, which gradually expanded into northern Mesopotamia and threatened Hittite influence in former Mitanni territories, forcing successive kings to recalibrate alliances and fortify northern borders. In the west, semi-independent Anatolian states and coastal polities resisted central control, requiring a combination of military campaigns, client rulers, and ritualized submission to maintain nominal Hittite authority. Trade, too, was an instrument of foreign policy, as control of key routes and access to luxury goods such as metals, textiles, and timber allowed the Hittites to bind allies economically and to display prestige that reinforced political hierarchies. The empire's ability to integrate diverse peoples was rooted not only in coercion but also in religious and cultural accommodation, as conquered populations were allowed to maintain local deities and rituals, often incorporated into the Hittite pantheon, thereby reducing resistance and facilitating loyalty. Within this international framework, Hittite kings presented themselves as intermediaries between humans and gods, portraying the empire itself as a divinely sanctioned order that both justified authority and imposed moral obligations on rulers and subjects alike. This ideology extended to the legal domain, where contracts, treaties, and disputes were framed in terms of divine oversight, ensuring that the enforcement of law carried cosmic as well as temporal significance. The Hittite approach to governance and diplomacy was thus holistic, integrating military, legal, religious, and economic tools to sustain influence across a multi-ethnic and geographically diverse realm. Nevertheless, the very mechanisms that allowed the Hittites to manage complexity also revealed vulnerabilities. Reliance on vassal loyalty, tribute, and communication across difficult terrain made the empire sensitive to environmental stress, economic disruption, and internal dissent, while the increasing militarization of neighboring powers such as Assyria and the destabilizing effects of migrating groups like the Sea Peoples exposed the limits of Hittite adaptability. By the late 13th and early 12th centuries BCE, these cumulative pressures eroded the empire's capacity to maintain external relationships and internal cohesion, culminating in the abandonment of Hattusa, the disintegration of vassal networks, and the disappearance of centralized authority. Yet even in collapse, the Hittites left enduring marks on the political culture of the Near East, as successor Neo-Hittite states preserved diplomatic, legal, and religious traditions, while Assyrian and later Mesopotamian rulers adopted Hittite treaty formulas and administrative techniques. Their model of integrating diverse populations through law, ritual, and negotiated obligation provided a blueprint for empire that resonated across centuries, illustrating how soft power, legitimacy, and ideology can be as decisive as military conquest in sustaining influence. Modern scholarship increasingly recognizes the Hittites as innovators in statecraft, whose blend of pragmatic governance, religious authority, and intercultural engagement allowed a relatively small population in central Anatolia to compete with the great powers of Egypt, Babylon, and Assyria. Their experience demonstrates that the management of complexity, rather than sheer size or military might, often defines the resilience and historical significance of empires. The Hittites also contributed to cultural exchange on a vast scale, facilitating the spread of art, religion, language, and technology across the eastern Mediterranean, while their archives preserve an unparalleled record of administrative thought, diplomatic nuance, and legal reasoning that continues to inform our understanding of the ancient world. By integrating military strategy, legal systems, religious ideology, and diplomatic acumen into a cohesive imperial framework, the Hittite Empire exemplifies how human societies attempt to impose order on a complex and often unstable world, leaving behind a legacy of political innovation, cultural synthesis, and historical consciousness that echoes far beyond the temporal limits of their rule and continues to offer insight into the challenges and possibilities inherent in the exercise of power. The Hittite Empire, viewed in its entirety, emerges as a civilization defined by adaptability, innovation, and the capacity to negotiate complexity in ways that shape the political, cultural, and intellectual landscape of the ancient Near East, offering profound lessons on the dynamics of empire, the interplay of power and belief, and the persistence of human creativity even amid instability. Central to the Hittite experience was the capacity to integrate diverse peoples and traditions into a coherent political system, a task accomplished through a combination of military strength, legal frameworks, religious accommodation, and diplomatic sophistication that allowed the state to project authority across Anatolia, northern Syria, and beyond. The empire's rulers recognized that dominance required more than conquest. It demanded the cultivation of legitimacy, the establishment of networks of loyalty, and the careful management of relationships with both internal elites and neighboring powers. Legal innovation was a cornerstone of this approach, as Hittite law codified social obligations, property rights, and dispute resolution in ways that emphasized restitution, proportionality, and fairness, reflecting a worldview in which stability depended on the orderly resolution of conflict rather than the arbitrary exercise of force. The Hittites also understood the power of symbolism, ritual, and religion as instruments of governance, embedding the authority of kingship within a cosmic order maintained by the gods and reinforced through ceremonies, oaths, and festivals that affirmed loyalty and reinforced communal cohesion. Their religious inclusivity, in which local deities were incorporated into state practice, demonstrates a pragmatic recognition that cultural diversity could be harnessed to political advantage, fostering allegiance while preserving the identities of subjugated or allied peoples. Diplomacy functioned alongside military power as a central tool of statecraft, with correspondence between Hittite kings and their counterparts in Egypt, Assyria, Babylonia, and Mitanni revealing a sophisticated understanding of negotiation, precedent, and mutual obligation. Treaties, often sworn before gods and inscribed in writing, established norms of international behavior, defined spheres of influence, and provided mechanisms for dispute resolution, highlighting an early form of regulated interstate relations in which honor, reputation, and religious sanction were as crucial as armed strength. The Hittites' military organization, meanwhile, reflected careful attention to strategy, logistics, and the integration of diverse forces, from chariotry to infantry, engineers, and auxiliary troops drawn from vassal populations, enabling sustained campaigns and flexible responses to both internal and external threats. Fortifications, border garrisons, and the strategic placement of cities complemented these capabilities, projecting both defensive strength and symbolic authority across the empire. Yet despite these sophisticated mechanisms, the Hittite Empire was vulnerable to cumulative pressures, including environmental stress, economic disruption, and the cascading effects of regional instability that characterized the Late Bronze Age. Grain shortages, resource constraints, and population pressures strained the social and administrative fabric, while invasions, rebellions, and the movements of groups such as the Sea Peoples tested the limits of Hittite authority and exposed the fragility inherent in complex, highly coordinated systems. The eventual collapse of the empire, marked by the abandonment of Hattusa and the fragmentation of vassal networks, illustrates the inherent tension between centralized power and the decentralized realities of a multi-ethnic, geographically dispersed state. Nevertheless, the Hittites' achievements were not erased by collapse, for the political, legal, and cultural patterns they established continued to influence successor Neo-Hittite states, neighboring powers, and the broader Near Eastern world. Hieroglyphic Luwian inscriptions, monumental reliefs, religious practice, treaty formulas, and administrative techniques provided continuity, linking the Iron Age polities of northern Syria and Anatolia to the traditions of the Bronze Age Empire. The Hittites also left a profound intellectual legacy, as their archives preserve evidence of historiography, divination, legal reasoning, and diplomatic strategy that continues to inform modern scholarship and shape understanding of how complex societies organized knowledge, authority, and interaction. Linguistically, the decipherment of Hittite has revolutionized the study of Indo-European languages, revealing archaic features that illuminate early language development and the spread of linguistic families across Eurasia, while archaeological and textual evidence offers unparalleled insight into the daily lives, social structures, and belief systems of a sophisticated ancient society. Art and architecture provide further testimony to the Hittites' creativity and vision, from the monumental gates, walls, and palaces of Hattusa to the open-air sanctuaries of Yazilikaya, where sculpted processions of gods and kings communicated both religious devotion and political legitimacy. These cultural expressions reflect a civilization capable of synthesizing influences from Hurrian, Mesopotamian, and indigenous Anatolian sources, producing a distinct identity that balanced innovation with continuity. The Hittite Empire's story also underscores the interplay between resilience and fragility in complex states, demonstrating how administrative sophistication, military strategy, and cultural flexibility can sustain power across centuries, yet remain susceptible to compounded stressors and systemic shocks. In examining the empire's rise, expansion, administration, and eventual collapse, scholars gain insight not only into the history of Anatolia and the Near East but also into broader questions of human organization, the management of diversity, and the conditions under which civilizations thrive or falter. Ultimately, the Hittites exemplify the capacity of human societies to construct durable institutions, manage complex social and political networks, and articulate comprehensive worldviews that integrate law, ritual, and diplomacy, leaving a legacy that transcends the temporal bounds of their empire. The enduring significance of the Hittite Empire lies not merely in the territories it controlled or the battles it fought, but in its profound contributions to the development of statecraft, law, religion, and culture, as well as its role in shaping the historical memory of the ancient Near East. By blending military innovation, legal sophistication, religious inclusivity, and diplomatic acumen, the Hittites created a model of imperial governance whose echoes persisted long after the political center fell, influencing neighboring civilizations and offering enduring insights into the challenges of power, legitimacy, and cultural integration. In this way, the Hittite Empire stands as a testament to the resilience of human creativity, the complexity of social organization, and the enduring impact of a civilization that, while ultimately undone by forces beyond its control, succeeded in leaving a multifaceted legacy that continues to illuminate the ancient world and enrich modern understanding of history. The final centuries of the Hittite Empire reveal a civilization navigating a period of intense internal and external pressure, demonstrating both the resilience and the vulnerabilities inherent in a complex Bronze Age state, as political, economic, and environmental factors converge to challenge the structures that had sustained the empire for centuries. By the late 13th century BCE, Hittite kings faced a rapidly shifting geopolitical landscape, with Assyria expanding aggressively to the east, Egypt asserting its influence in Syria, and a variety of smaller Anatolian and Syrian polities resisting imperial control or exploiting instability for their own gain. The central administration, once capable of projecting authority through a combination of royal decrees, treaties, and religious sanction, increasingly struggled to maintain cohesion across distant provinces, while logistical challenges, including the transport of grain, metal, and other resources to support both urban centers and military campaigns, intensified in the face of environmental variability and declining agricultural yields. Internal challenges compounded these pressures, as succession disputes, palace intrigue, and local revolts placed additional strain on the political hierarchy, undermining the capacity of kings to enforce compliance and maintain loyalty among vassals and officials. At the same time, Hittite military power, which had relied on a combination of chariotry, infantry, and conscripted forces from subject territories, faced growing limitations, as neighboring states improved their own tactical and organizational capabilities, and as the empire's resources were increasingly stretched thin by repeated campaigns and the need to defend long and exposed frontiers. Archaeological evidence suggests that fortifications were reinforced and new settlements established in an effort to stabilize key regions, yet the broader patterns indicate that these measures were ultimately insufficient to counter the cumulative pressures eroding imperial authority. Diplomacy, historically a tool of considerable sophistication for the Hittites, continued to play a role, with treaties, marriages, and correspondence employed to manage relations with Egypt, Assyria, and the remnants of Mitanni, yet the balance of power was shifting decisively against Hittite dominance, and the limitations of negotiated authority became increasingly apparent as vassal states pursued independence or realigned with more potent neighbors. In the religious sphere, ritual and divination assumed heightened importance as leaders sought to interpret omens, avert disaster, and restore cosmic balance in response to political and natural crises, reflecting a worldview in which divine favor was inseparable from material success. Texts from this period reveal a proliferation of ceremonies, offerings, and magical practices intended to protect the king, the state, and the population, demonstrating both a continuity of belief and a growing anxiety in the face of mounting threats. Despite these challenges, Hittite culture continued to flourish in terms of literature, art, and architecture, with monumental inscriptions, rock reliefs, and palace decorations preserving narratives of kingship, divine favor, and military accomplishment even as the empire's political cohesion waned. Such evidence underscores the resilience of cultural identity, illustrating that the collapse of political structures did not equate to the disappearance of artistic, religious, or intellectual expression. The culmination of these pressures, however, led to the eventual abandonment of Hattusa and the fragmentation of central authority around the early 12th century BCE, a process that coincided with the broader Bronze Age collapse affecting much of the eastern Mediterranean and Near East. Cities were destroyed or deserted, trade networks disrupted, and formerly integrated regions descended into relative political fragmentation, yet the memory of the Hittite Empire persisted through successor Neo-Hittite states, which maintained Hittite traditions in governance, religion, and art while adapting to new geopolitical realities. These states, often located in northern Syria and southeastern Anatolia, employed royal titulature, hieroglyphic Luwian inscriptions, and monumental reliefs that echoed Hittite forms, providing continuity and a sense of legitimacy even amid diminished territorial control. The Hittite influence also extended beyond the immediate post-collapse period, as neighboring powers such as Assyria adopted and modified aspects of Hittite legal, administrative, and diplomatic practices, indicating that the empire's contributions to political culture outlasted its material dominion. From an archaeological and textual perspective, the Hittite Empire offers unparalleled insights into Bronze Age statecraft, revealing how a civilization balanced military might, administrative sophistication, religious ideology, and diplomacy to manage a multicultural and geographically complex realm. Its collapse illustrates the vulnerability of even highly organized systems to compounded environmental, economic, and political stressors, yet the persistence of cultural, legal, and diplomatic practices demonstrates the enduring impact of Hittite innovation. Modern scholarship has increasingly emphasized this duality, recognizing both the empire's achievements in governance, law, and intercultural integration and the structural limitations that rendered it susceptible to systemic failure. The study of the Hittites also illuminates broader questions about the nature of empire, the dynamics of cultural continuity and transformation, and the ways in which human societies confront uncertainty, demonstrating that resilience is as much about intellectual, legal, and religious structures as it is about military or economic power. The Hittite experience underscores the interdependence of political, social, and environmental factors in sustaining complex states and highlights the role of belief, ritual, and cultural identity in maintaining cohesion under pressure. By integrating military strategy, diplomacy, legal frameworks, and religious practice into a coherent system, the Hittites created an empire whose influence extended far beyond the borders and lifespan of its central administration, shaping the historical and cultural development of Anatolia and the Near East for centuries to come. In reflecting upon the final phase of the Hittite Empire, it becomes clear that the story of Hattusa and its kings is not simply one of decline, but of the enduring tension between ambition and constraint, innovation and vulnerability, demonstrating how even in the face of collapse, the intellectual, cultural, and political legacies of a civilization can resonate long after its political structures have vanished. The Hittite Empire, in its rise, flourishing, and eventual disintegration, thus serves as a profound case study in the complexities of ancient statecraft, the management of diverse societies, and the capacity of human communities to create lasting patterns of thought, law, ritual, and governance that continue to inform our understanding of history, power, and cultural resilience. The study of the Hittite Empire in its final and transformative phases reveals not only the dynamics of decline but also the enduring mechanisms of adaptation, cultural continuity, and regional influence that defined its long-term impact on Anatolia and the broader Near East, offering an extraordinary example of how a civilization can persist intellectually and institutionally even when political structures falter. Following the abandonment of Hattusa in the early 12th century BCE, the collapse of centralized authority created a vacuum that fragmented the once unified empire into a constellation of smaller polities, often referred to as the Neo-Hittite or Syro-Hittite states, which carried forward many of the administrative, religious, and cultural practices of their predecessors while responding to the realities of the post-Bronze Age world. These successor states, located primarily in northern Syria, southeastern Anatolia, and the upper Euphrates region, demonstrate remarkable continuity in their use of hieroglyphic Luwian inscriptions, monumental reliefs, and royal titulature, emphasizing dynastic legitimacy and divine sanction while adapting to smaller territorial scales and shifting geopolitical pressures. The persistence of Hittite religious practices in these regions, including the veneration of the storm god, the sun goddess of Arina, and other major deities, illustrates the resilience of ritual frameworks as tools for maintaining social cohesion, mediating political authority, and legitimizing rulership even amid broader systemic collapse. In tandem, these states preserved elements of the Hittite legal and administrative systems, including codified obligations of vassals, taxation practices, and property regulation, ensuring that the organizational principles of the former empire continued to guide daily governance and reinforce hierarchical social structures. While their military capacity was reduced compared to the imperial era, Neo-Hittite states maintained fortified centers and strategically positioned garrisons to defend against encroaching powers such as Assyria and emerging Aramean polities, demonstrating a pragmatic adaptation to the constraints of reduced resources and fragmented territories. Diplomacy continued to play a critical role, with local rulers engaging in correspondence, tribute exchanges, and alliances to manage relations with more powerful neighbors, often invoking the authority and tradition of the Hittite kings as a means of asserting legitimacy in negotiations. The persistence of these practices underscores the degree to which cultural and institutional legacies can outlive centralized political control, allowing former imperial norms to shape regional interactions long after the collapse of the state that created them. Simultaneously, the broader Eastern Mediterranean context of the early Iron Age was marked by population movements, trade disruptions, and shifting centers of power, creating both challenges and opportunities for former Hittite elites who sought to assert influence within new political landscapes. The diffusion of Hittite artistic motifs, administrative methods, and religious iconography across these regions reflects not only a continuity of identity but also the empire's capacity for cultural transmission, illustrating how the aesthetic and symbolic dimensions of Hittite civilization contributed to the formation of hybridized cultural forms that bridged Anatolian, Syrian, and Mesopotamian traditions. From a historiographical perspective, the Hittite Empire provides a unique lens through which to understand the interplay between material power, ideological authority, and institutional resilience, as the empire's extensive archives, comprising treaties, annals, ritual texts, and legal codes, offer unparalleled insight into the mechanisms by which a complex state managed relations both internally and externally. These records reveal a sophisticated awareness of reputation, precedent, and divine oversight, demonstrating that the Hittites conceptualized governance not as the arbitrary exercise of force but as the orchestration of social, legal, and religious norms across diverse populations and territories. The emphasis on treaties, oaths, and divine witness reflects a worldview in which stability depended as much on moral and spiritual legitimacy as on military capability, highlighting the integration of law, ritual, and diplomacy in sustaining authority. In intellectual terms, the Hittites also preserved a rich corpus of mythological and literary texts, including adaptations of Hurrian and Mesopotamian narratives that explored themes of succession, justice, divine-human interaction, and the maintenance of cosmic order, providing both a theological framework and a model for political reflection. Such texts demonstrate that historical consciousness and the interpretation of human events through myth and ritual were central to Hittite identity, linking past precedent to present decision-making and reinforcing the ideological foundations of rulership. Linguistically, the empire's records, written in cuneiform and hieroglyphic Luwian, preserve evidence of multilingual administration and cross-cultural communication, reflecting an early capacity for managing diversity through documentation and codified procedures. These texts not only facilitated governance but also transmitted knowledge across generations, creating a durable intellectual infrastructure that outlasted the collapse of political authority and influenced subsequent civilizations. The archaeological record further attests to the Hittites' long-term impact, from the monumental gates, temples, and fortifications of Hattusa to the open-air sanctuaries and reliefs that persisted in Neo-Hittite centers, demonstrating a continuity of architectural innovation, religious symbolism, and artistic expression. Even as urban centers were abandoned or destroyed, the spatial organization of settlements, the symbolic use of monumental art, and the ritualized treatment of sacred spaces continued to inform the cultural landscape of Anatolia and northern Syria. The Hittite Empire's final centuries and its aftermath thus illustrate the dual nature of historical legacy. While political collapse underscores the fragility of centralized authority, the persistence of cultural, legal, and intellectual structures demonstrates the capacity of human societies to transmit knowledge, belief, and institutional practice across generations and geopolitical shifts. Modern scholarship increasingly recognizes the Hittites not only as conquerors and empire builders but also as innovators in governance, law, diplomacy, and cultural synthesis, whose experience provides enduring lessons on the management of complexity, the integration of diverse populations, and the interplay between material power and ideological authority. By examining the empire's rise, administration, challenges, and eventual fragmentation, historians gain insight into the way civilizations negotiate the tension between centralization and flexibility, coercion and accommodation, continuity and change. The Neo-Hittite states, in preserving elements of Hittite tradition while adapting to new realities, highlight the importance of institutional memory and cultural identity in shaping post-imperial societies, demonstrating that collapse is rarely absolute and that influence can persist through adaptation, hybridization, and selective continuity. In reflecting upon the Hittite Empire in its entirety, it becomes evident that its significance lies not solely in territorial expansion, military conquest, or dynastic achievement, but in the integrated systems of law, ritual, diplomacy, and cultural expression that allowed it to function as a sophisticated, multi-ethnic, and long-lasting civilization. The endurance of these structures and ideas, transmitted through successor states, neighboring powers, and eventually rediscovered by modern scholarship, underscores the profound and multifaceted legacy of the Hittites. Their example illuminates the dynamics of ancient statecraft, the resilience of human institutions, and the enduring capacity of societies to shape history even amid upheaval, offering insights that continue to inform our understanding of political organization, cultural integration, and the complex interplay of power, belief, and identity across time. The Hittite Empire, in its full historical arc, represents one of the most instructive examples of a Bronze Age civilization that combined military prowess, administrative sophistication, religious complexity, and diplomatic acumen to construct a durable and influential state, yet ultimately confronted the vulnerabilities inherent in managing a multi-ethnic, geographically dispersed polity under the pressures of environmental change, external aggression, and internal instability. From the earliest consolidation of Hattusa as the imperial capital, the Hittites developed a system of governance that balanced centralized authority with delegated regional administration, employing governors, military commanders, and scribes to enforce royal decrees, collect tribute, and maintain communication across mountains, river valleys, and frontier zones. This structure enabled the empire to extend its influence into northern Syria, western Anatolia, and beyond, incorporating diverse populations through a combination of coercion, accommodation, and negotiated loyalty. Central to the Hittite approach was a sophisticated understanding of law and obligation, codified in a legal system that emphasized restitution, proportionality, and the integration of divine authority into human governance. Kings acted not as arbitrary rulers but as custodians of cosmic and social order, responsible for ensuring justice, enforcing treaties, and maintaining harmony between gods, elites, and the general populace. The integration of religion into the political and legal framework reinforced legitimacy, as oaths, treaties, and punishments were witnessed by the gods, making violations not only socially but cosmically consequential. Militarily, the Hittites combined traditional infantry with highly developed chariot units, engineering expertise, and auxiliary forces drawn from subject populations, allowing them to conduct sustained campaigns, defend expansive borders, and engage with contemporary powers such as Egypt, Mitanni, and Assyria on terms that were strategically calculated. Chariot warfare, coupled with the careful use of terrain, intelligence gathering, and supply logistics, provided the Hittites with a tactical flexibility that underpinned both offensive operations and defensive campaigns. Fortifications, city walls, and frontier garrisons complemented these efforts, projecting strength while signaling political authority and stability to both domestic subjects and external rivals. Diplomacy functioned as an equally essential instrument of Hittite power. Royal correspondence, marriage alliances, and meticulously crafted treaties exemplify the empire's understanding of soft power, negotiation, and the management of interstate relations. The peace treaty with Egypt following the Battle of Kadesh is emblematic of this strategy, establishing a framework for cooperation, extradition, and mutual defense that relied on shared norms, precedent, and the invocation of divine witnesses to ensure compliance. Trade, both domestic and international, reinforced these connections, as control of key resources such as metals, timber, and luxury goods allowed the Hittites to exercise economic influence and foster dependency that complemented political and military authority. Within the empire, cultural and religious plurality was managed through inclusion and adaptation rather than suppression. Local gods and rituals were often incorporated into the Hittite pantheon, reflecting a pragmatic recognition that cultural accommodation could strengthen loyalty and reduce the risk of rebellion. Hittite myths and ritual texts, adapted from Hurrian, Mesopotamian, and indigenous Anatolian sources, provided a shared ideological framework, linking divine narratives to political legitimacy and social morality. These texts illustrate the Hittite emphasis on historical consciousness, causal reasoning, and moral order, framing both success and failure in terms of cosmic as well as human causality. Despite this sophisticated integration of military, legal, religious, and diplomatic strategies, the Hittite Empire faced structural vulnerabilities. Dependence on vassal loyalty, long supply lines, and centralized coordination made the state susceptible to environmental stress, population pressures, and economic disruption, while increasing external aggression, from rising Assyria in the east to destabilizing migratory groups such as the Sea Peoples, tested the limits of imperial resilience. Palace intrigues, succession disputes, and internal revolts further strained cohesion, highlighting the delicate balance between central authority and regional autonomy. By the early 12th century BCE, these combined pressures led to the collapse of Hattusa, the fragmentation of the imperial administration, and the emergence of successor Neo-Hittite states, which preserved many cultural, religious, and administrative traditions while adapting to the realities of smaller territorial control and regional instability. These successor kingdoms, often located in northern Syria and southeastern Anatolia, continued to employ hieroglyphic Luwian inscriptions, monumental reliefs, and dynastic titulature to assert legitimacy, maintain continuity, and reinforce the ideological frameworks inherited from the Hittite Empire. They preserved religious practices, including the veneration of major Hittite deities and ritual forms, while adapting to localized contexts, demonstrating the persistence of identity and institutional memory even in the absence of centralized imperial authority. The Neo-Hittite states also maintained aspects of the legal and administrative systems, including property regulation, taxation, and vassal obligations, highlighting the durability of Hittite governance models in a changed geopolitical environment. Beyond the immediate post-collapse period, the influence of the Hittites extended into neighboring civilizations. Assyria, Babylon, and later Iron Age states adopted and adapted elements of Hittite diplomacy, treaty formulation, legal thought, and artistic expression, illustrating the broader regional imprint of Hittite innovations. Culturally, Hittite artistic motifs, monumental architecture, and religious symbolism continued to inform Anatolian and Syrian traditions, contributing to a shared cultural vocabulary that bridged political and temporal boundaries. From a modern historiographical perspective, the Hittite Empire offers unparalleled insight into the management of complex societies, the integration of military, legal, and religious institutions, and the dynamics of cultural transmission in the ancient world. Its archives, encompassing treaties, ritual texts, annals, and correspondence, provide a detailed record of administrative sophistication, international relations, and intellectual engagement, revealing a civilization capable of both practical governance and reflective understanding of its own historical and cosmic context. The Hittites exemplify the interplay between resilience and fragility, demonstrating that centralized power, however sophisticated, remains vulnerable to compounded stressors, yet cultural, intellectual, and institutional legacies can endure long beyond the collapse of political structures. Linguistically, the decipherment of Hittite has revolutionized understanding of Indo-European language development, revealing archaic features that illuminate the spread and evolution of languages across Eurasia, while archaeological evidence from Hattusa, Yazilikaya, and Neo-Hittite centers illuminates continuity in urban planning, fortification, and ritual practice. Ultimately, the Hittite Empire stands as a testament to the capacities of human societies to organize, govern, and create meaning in a complex and often unstable world. Its integration of military strategy, legal innovation, religious ideology, diplomacy, and cultural expression created an empire that, though eventually undone by external and internal pressures, left a multifaceted legacy that influenced the Near East for centuries and continues to inform modern understanding of ancient civilization, statecraft, and cultural resilience. Through its achievements and its collapse, the Hittite Empire offers enduring lessons on the management of complexity, the negotiation of diversity, and the enduring power of ideas, institutions, and cultural identity to shape history long after political authority has faded. The Hittite Empire, in its long and complex history, serves as a vivid example of the dynamic interplay between power, culture, and innovation in the Late Bronze Age, illustrating how a civilization situated at the crossroads of Anatolia, Syria, and Mesopotamia could construct a sophisticated state apparatus capable of managing diversity, projecting influence, and leaving a lasting imprint on regional history, even amid eventual political collapse. From its earliest formation, the Hittites developed a system of governance that balanced centralized royal authority with delegated regional control, appointing governors, military officials, and scribes to oversee vassal territories, collect tribute, administer justice, and coordinate military obligations, ensuring that the king's authority could extend over geographically dispersed and culturally heterogeneous populations. This administrative sophistication was mirrored in the Hittites' legal and diplomatic frameworks, which emphasized codified obligations, restitution over retribution, and the integration of divine sanction into human governance, creating a system in which social, legal, and cosmic order were inseparable. Kingship itself was framed as a sacred office, with the monarch serving as mediator between gods and people, responsible for preserving justice, ensuring stability, and conducting rituals that reaffirmed both political authority and cosmic balance. Religious practice was thus deeply intertwined with political legitimacy, with extensive pantheons, ritual ceremonies, and divination practices shaping the social and moral landscape of the empire, while also serving as tools for governance, conflict resolution, and the integration of conquered or allied populations. Hittite military organization was another pillar of imperial strength, combining highly trained chariot units, infantry forces drawn from both the heartland and subject territories, and sophisticated engineering and logistical planning, enabling campaigns across mountains, river valleys, and frontier regions. Fortifications, strategic urban planning, and garrison settlements projected authority and provided defensive resilience, while also serving symbolic functions, asserting the presence of Hittite power across both domestic and border regions. In parallel, diplomacy functioned as a critical instrument of statecraft, allowing the Hittites to negotiate with contemporaneous powers such as Egypt, Assyria, Mitanni, and Babylonia. Treaties, oaths, and written correspondence codified obligations, mediated disputes, and facilitated alliances, demonstrating a nuanced understanding of international relations that combined practical negotiation with ritualized legitimacy. The famous treaty between Hattusili III and Ramses II following the Battle of Kadesh exemplifies this approach, establishing not only peace but also mutual defense obligations, marital alliances, and reciprocal recognition of authority, all reinforced by the invocation of divine witnesses to ensure compliance. Trade and economic integration complemented these political and military strategies, as control over resources such as metals, timber, and luxury goods enabled the Hittites to exercise soft power, influence regional economies, and support both domestic infrastructure and military operations. At the same time, the empire's cultural policies emphasized inclusivity and adaptability, allowing local religious traditions to persist alongside state-sanctioned cults and incorporating foreign myths, ritual practices, and artistic motifs into the imperial framework. Hittite mythological texts, including adaptations of Hurrian and Mesopotamian narratives, reinforced political ideology, codified moral expectations, and provided a shared historical consciousness, linking divine action with human governance and legitimizing royal decisions through a theological lens. Despite this sophisticated integration of military, legal, religious, and diplomatic tools, the Hittite Empire was vulnerable to the cumulative pressures that characterized the Late Bronze Age world. Environmental stress, including fluctuations in agricultural productivity and resource scarcity, strained urban centers and supply networks, while internal disputes, palace intrigue, and succession crises undermined centralized authority. Simultaneously, external threats intensified, as rising Assyria expanded eastward, Egyptian influence waxed and waned in Syria, and migratory groups such as the Sea Peoples destabilized regional trade and settlement patterns. The combination of these factors gradually eroded the coherence of the state, culminating in the abandonment of Hattusa, the disintegration of administrative networks, and the emergence of Neo-Hittite polities that preserved elements of imperial culture while adapting to smaller-scale political realities. These successor states, scattered across northern Syria and southeastern Anatolia, maintained hieroglyphic Luwian inscriptions, monumental reliefs, and dynastic titulature, demonstrating continuity in ideology, religious practice, and governance despite the absence of centralized imperial authority. They preserved ritual traditions, venerated major Hittite deities, and continued to employ legal and administrative frameworks derived from the empire, illustrating the durability of institutional memory and the persistence of cultural identity in post-imperial contexts. Beyond their immediate territories, the Hittites exerted lasting influence on neighboring civilizations. Assyria and Babylonia, for example, adopted and adapted Hittite treaty forms, administrative practices, and artistic motifs, while Iron Age Anatolian and Syrian cultures absorbed elements of Hittite religion, language, and ceremonial symbolism. Linguistically, the preservation and eventual decipherment of Hittite texts have provided critical insight into the early Indo-European language family, revealing archaic features and contributing to understanding of linguistic evolution across Eurasia. Archaeologically, the remains of Hattusa, Yazilakaya, and other Hittite and Neo-Hittite sites provide evidence of sophisticated urban planning, monumental architecture, and symbolic landscape use, demonstrating both practical governance and the ideological expression of authority. The empire's artistic achievements, including relief sculpture, ceremonial gateways, and palace decoration, communicate narratives of kingship, divine favor, and historical memory, preserving the visual language of power and legitimacy across generations. The Hittite Empire's historical trajectory thus exemplifies both the potential and limits of complex statecraft. Its successes in integrating diverse populations, maintaining long-distance authority, and projecting power through combined military, legal, religious, and diplomatic means illustrate the capacities of sophisticated political systems. Conversely, the empire's eventual collapse highlights the vulnerability of centralized structures to environmental, economic, and political stress, revealing the delicate balance required to sustain multi-ethnic, geographically dispersed polities. From a modern perspective, the Hittites provide an unparalleled case study in the management of complexity, the durability of cultural and institutional innovations, and the ways in which legacy can outlast political control. Their records reveal a civilization capable of strategic foresight, legal reasoning, and reflective governance, while their material and intellectual heritage demonstrates the enduring power of ideas, ritual, and administrative practice in shaping subsequent societies. In sum, the Hittite Empire's rise, consolidation, governance, and decline illuminate the interplay between military strength, legal order, religious ideology, and diplomatic sophistication, offering a model of Bronze Age statecraft that continues to inform our understanding of political resilience, cultural continuity, and the enduring impact of civilizations long after their central authority has disappeared. By integrating pragmatic governance with symbolic and religious legitimacy, the Hittites constructed an empire whose influence persisted in successor states, neighboring civilizations, and modern scholarship, providing enduring lessons on the management of power, diversity, and historical memory in the ancient world. The Hittite Empire, spanning the Late Bronze Age, stands as a remarkable illustration of how a civilization at the crossroads of Anatolia, Syria, and Mesopotamia constructed a durable, multifaceted, and highly sophisticated society capable of exerting influence far beyond its core territories while navigating the immense challenges of geography, diversity, and shifting political landscapes, and its history offers profound insights into the nature of power, resilience, and cultural legacy. From its earliest consolidation under kings such as Labarna and Hattusili I, the empire developed a centralized yet flexible administrative system that delegated authority to regional governors and military commanders while maintaining direct oversight over taxation, legal adjudication, and resource distribution, enabling the rulers of Hattusa to project control across a multi-ethnic empire that encompassed Anatolian highlands, northern Syria, and key trade corridors linking the eastern Mediterranean and Mesopotamia. Central to Hittite governance was a codified legal system that emphasized restitution, proportionality, and the integration of religious authority into the enforcement of law, establishing a framework in which justice was not only a social imperative but also a divine obligation, reflecting the empire's understanding that stability required both moral and political legitimacy. Kingship itself was conceived as a sacred office, with rulers serving as intermediaries between gods and humans, responsible for conducting rituals, enforcing treaties, and adjudicating disputes in ways that affirmed both earthly authority and cosmic order, while religious practice provided a unifying framework for diverse populations, incorporating local deities and ritual traditions into the imperial pantheon to foster allegiance and reduce resistance. The Hittite military was equally sophisticated, combining chariotry, infantry, and auxiliary forces drawn from subject populations to conduct campaigns across difficult terrain, defend strategic frontiers, and respond flexibly to internal and external threats, while fortifications, urban planning, and garrison settlements both enhanced security and projected symbolic authority, signaling the presence of Hittite power across the empire. Diplomacy complemented military strength, forming an essential pillar of imperial strategy, as kings engaged in correspondence, treaties, and marriage alliances with Egypt, Assyria, Mitanni, Babylonia, and other regional powers, often invoking divine witnesses to legitimize agreements and ensure compliance. The famed peace treaty between Hattusili III and Ramses II, for example, illustrates the empire's capacity for negotiation and long-term strategic planning, incorporating clauses on mutual defense, extradition, and dynastic marriages, and demonstrating that influence depended as much on legal, religious, and diplomatic acumen as on battlefield success. Economic strategy was intertwined with these political and military frameworks, as control of resources, trade routes, and luxury goods allowed the Hittites to exercise both coercive and soft power, binding allies and vassals through material as well as ideological means, while the circulation of metals, textiles, timber, and foodstuffs supported urban centers, military operations, and regional stability. Culturally, the empire fostered a rich intellectual and artistic tradition, blending Anatolian, Hurrian, and Mesopotamian motifs to produce distinctive monumental reliefs, palace decoration, and ritual inscriptions that conveyed narratives of kingship, divine favor, and historical memory, reinforcing both political authority and shared identity. Mythological and ritual texts, often preserved in cuneiform or hieroglyphic Luwian, explored themes of divine-human interaction, succession, morality, and the maintenance of cosmic order, linking theological concepts to governance and providing a framework through which rulers and subjects understood historical and social events. Despite these achievements, the Hittite Empire faced inherent structural vulnerabilities, including dependence on vassal loyalty, long supply chains, and a centralized bureaucracy that could be disrupted by environmental stress, economic shortfalls, or internal dissent. External pressures, particularly the expansion of Assyria, fluctuating Egyptian influence, and incursions by migratory groups such as the Sea Peoples, compounded internal weaknesses, while succession disputes, palace intrigue, and localized revolts challenged the cohesion of the ruling elite. By the early 12th century BCE, these cumulative pressures culminated in the abandonment of Hattusa, signaling the collapse of centralized authority, the fragmentation of the empire, and the emergence of smaller Neo-Hittite states that preserved Hittite cultural, religious, and administrative traditions while adapting to new geopolitical realities. These successor states, located across northern Syria and southeastern Anatolia, maintained hieroglyphic Luwian inscriptions, monumental reliefs, dynastic titles, and ritual practices, demonstrating both continuity and adaptation, as rulers leveraged inherited ideological frameworks to assert legitimacy, maintain social cohesion, and navigate the post-imperial landscape. Legal and administrative practices, including property regulation, taxation, and vassal obligations, persisted in these territories, illustrating the resilience of institutional memory and the enduring influence of Hittite governance. The Hittites' cultural impact extended beyond their immediate successors, influencing Assyrian and Babylonian practices in law, diplomacy, and art, while the diffusion of Hittite religious iconography, monumental styles, and ceremonial forms contributed to the shared cultural vocabulary of the region. Archaeological evidence from Hattusa, Yazilikiah, and Neo-Hittite centers reveals advanced urban planning, symbolic architectural expression, and the integration of religious and political spaces, demonstrating that the Hittites understood the interplay between material, ideological, and social dimensions of power. Linguistically, the preservation of Hittite texts has provided critical insights into early Indo-European languages, revealing archaic structures and contributing to a broader understanding of language development and cultural exchange across Eurasia. Modern scholarship increasingly recognizes that the Hittite Empire's significance lies not only in its territorial conquests or military engagements but also in its sophisticated integration of law, diplomacy, religion, and administration, illustrating that the endurance of a civilization is as much about intellectual and cultural infrastructure as it is about material power. The empire's history exemplifies the challenges faced by complex states in balancing centralization with regional autonomy, coercion with accommodation, and tradition with adaptation, while its legacy demonstrates the persistence of identity, institutional knowledge, and cultural influence even after political collapse. In reflecting on the Hittite Empire, it becomes clear that its achievements in statecraft, law, ritual, diplomacy, and art provided a foundation for successor states and neighboring civilizations, shaping the political and cultural evolution of Anatolia and the Near East for centuries. The enduring significance of the Hittites lies not only in their historical accomplishments but also in the insights they offer into human capacity for organization, governance, and cultural synthesis in a complex and often unpredictable world. Through the integration of military strategy, legal codification, religious authority, diplomatic skill, and artistic expression, the Hittites created a civilization whose influence transcended its temporal and geographic boundaries, offering enduring lessons on resilience, innovation, and the management of human societies. Their story, from the rise of Hattusa to the emergence of Neo-Hittite polities, exemplifies the interplay of ambition, adaptability, and legacy, demonstrating that even in the face of collapse, the ideas, institutions, and cultural achievements of a civilization can persist and continue to shape history, leaving an indelible mark on the civilizations that followed and providing a rich source of knowledge for modern understanding of the ancient world. The Hittite Empire, throughout its extensive and multifaceted history, demonstrates the complex interplay between power, culture, and diplomacy in the Late Bronze Age, illustrating how a civilization situated at the crossroads of Anatolia, Syria, and Mesopotamia could establish a durable and sophisticated political system while negotiating the inherent challenges of geographic diversity, ethnic plurality, and shifting international pressures, and its legacy provides enduring insights into the mechanisms of empire, the resilience of culture, and the transmission of ideas across generations. From the early consolidation of Hattusa as a central capital under rulers such as Labarna and Hattusili I, the Hittites developed an administrative framework that combined centralized authority with delegated regional governance, appointing governors, military commanders, and scribes to oversee vassal territories, manage taxation, enforce legal obligations, and coordinate both civil and military logistics, thereby enabling the king to exercise influence over a geographically and culturally heterogeneous empire. This administrative sophistication was reinforced by a codified legal system that emphasized restitution, proportionality, and the integration of religious sanction into the enforcement of law, reflecting the Hittite conception that social stability and cosmic order were inseparable, and that the legitimacy of kingship depended upon the ruler's ability to maintain justice, honor treaties, and perform ritual obligations that aligned human society with divine will. Kingship was thus inherently sacred, with rulers acting as mediators between gods and men, conducting ceremonies, interpreting omens, and executing judicial authority, while religion itself functioned as a central organizing principle that facilitated loyalty, social cohesion, and the integration of local deities and ritual practices into a broader imperial pantheon. Militarily, the Hittites achieved notable sophistication, combining chariot units, infantry contingents, and auxiliary troops drawn from subject populations to wage campaigns, secure borders, and respond to both internal revolts and external threats, while fortifications, garrison towns, and strategic urban planning allowed the projection of authority across the empire and provided both defensive strength and symbolic representation of power. Diplomacy complemented military prowess as a critical instrument of Hittite statecraft, exemplified by extensive correspondence and treaties with Egypt, Assyria, Mitanni, Babylonia, and other contemporary powers, which employed formalized clauses, oath-taking, and divine witnesses to regulate interstate relations, mediate disputes, and secure alliances, as seen in the historic peace treaty between Hattusili III and Ramses II, which combined military cessation with dynastic marriages and mutual defense commitments. Economic management was equally essential, with the control of metals, timber, luxury goods, and grain facilitating trade, supporting military operations, reinforcing vassal loyalty, and sustaining urban centers, illustrating the Hittites' understanding of the interdependence of material resources, political authority, and social stability. Culturally, the Hittites fostered a rich tradition of art, literature, and ritual practice that synthesized indigenous Anatolian elements with Hurrian and Mesopotamian influences, producing monumental reliefs, palace decorations, and ceremonial inscriptions that conveyed political ideology, divine favor, and historical memory, while mythological and ritual texts explored themes of kingship, morality, succession, and cosmic order, linking theological reflection with political authority and societal expectations. Despite these strengths, the Hittite Empire faced structural vulnerabilities inherent to complex, multi-ethnic, and geographically dispersed states. Dependence on the loyalty of vassals, long supply chains, and centralized administrative coordination left the empire susceptible to environmental stress, resource shortages, internal rebellion, and palace intrigue, while external pressures from Assyria, shifting Egyptian power, and migratory groups such as the Sea Peoples imposed further challenges. These cumulative pressures contributed to the eventual collapse of centralized authority in the early 12th century BCE, marked by the abandonment of Hattusa and the fragmentation of imperial administration. In the aftermath, Neo-Hittite states emerged across northern Syria and southeastern Anatolia, preserving Hittite cultural, religious, and administrative traditions while adapting to the realities of smaller territories, regional autonomy, and a transformed geopolitical landscape. These successor polities maintained hieroglyphic Luwian inscriptions, monumental reliefs, dynastic titulature, and ritual practices, asserting legitimacy and continuity through inherited ideological frameworks while also integrating local traditions and responding pragmatically to new political realities. Legal and administrative practices, including taxation, property regulation, and vassal obligations, persisted in these contexts, reflecting the durability of Hittite institutional memory, while fortifications, urban layouts, and ceremonial centers ensured the symbolic presence of authority and reinforced social cohesion. The Hittites' cultural influence extended far beyond the immediate post-collapse period, as Assyria, Babylonia, and later Iron Age states adopted and adapted Hittite models of diplomacy, law, and artistic expression, while the diffusion of Hittite religious iconography, monumental architecture, and ceremonial forms shaped the visual and ideological vocabulary of neighboring societies. Archaeological evidence, from the ruins of Hattusa to open-air sanctuaries like Yazilikaya and Neo-Hittite centers, illustrates the sophistication of urban planning, the symbolic integration of religious and political spaces, and the deliberate communication of authority through monumental art, while linguistic studies of Hittite cuneiform and hieroglyphic texts have provided critical insights into early Indo-European languages and cross-cultural communication across Eurasia. Modern scholarship increasingly recognizes that the significance of the Hittite Empire lies not solely in military conquest or territorial expansion, but in its integrated systems of law, governance, diplomacy, and religious practice, demonstrating that the endurance of civilization depends as much upon intellectual, cultural, and institutional infrastructure as upon material power. The Hittite historical trajectory exemplifies both the capabilities and limits of complex states, revealing how centralization, delegation, cultural synthesis, and legal religious legitimacy can sustain a multi-ethnic empire for centuries, yet also how cumulative pressures, environmental, economic, social, and external, can overwhelm even the most sophisticated institutions. The Neo-Hittite polities, in preserving and adapting these legacies, illustrate the persistence of cultural identity, institutional knowledge, and political ideology beyond the collapse of central authority, showing that influence can endure through continuity, adaptation, and transmission. The Hittite Empire thus provides a paradigm for understanding the dynamics of resilience, collapse, and legacy in human societies, emphasizing the interdependence of military strategy, administrative innovation, religious legitimacy, economic management, and diplomatic skill in sustaining power and coherence. Its history underscores the complex negotiation between centralization and regional autonomy, coercion and accommodation, tradition and adaptation, offering enduring lessons on governance, cultural integration, and the transmission of knowledge across generations. Ultimately, the Hittites' contributions to law, ritual, diplomacy, art, architecture, and language created a civilization whose impact transcended its temporal and geographic boundaries, influencing neighboring societies and shaping the intellectual and cultural heritage of the Near East for centuries. The empire's rise, consolidation, achievements, and eventual disintegration provide a rich case study in the construction, maintenance, and adaptation of complex political systems, demonstrating the enduring power of ideas, institutions, and cultural identity to shape human history. Through the integration of military, administrative, legal, religious, and diplomatic strategies, the Hittites achieved a model of governance whose legacy persisted long after the collapse of Hattusa, influencing successor states, neighboring powers, and the broader historical memory of the region, and offering modern scholars profound insights into the organization, resilience, and enduring influence of ancient civilizations. The Hittite Empire, in its entirety, represents a complex and instructive case of ancient statecraft, illustrating how a Bronze Age civilization positioned at the crossroads of Anatolia, Syria, and Mesopotamia could establish, maintain, and extend political, military, and cultural influence over a vast and diverse region while confronting the inherent challenges of geography, ethnicity, and the dynamics of international relations, and its history provides enduring lessons on the nature of power, institutional resilience, and cultural transmission. From the earliest consolidation of Hattusa as a central capital under rulers such as Labarna and Hattusili I, the Hittites implemented an administrative framework that combined centralized authority with regional delegation, appointing governors, military officials, and scribes to supervise vassal territories, administer justice, collect tribute, and coordinate resources for both civil governance and military operations, thereby enabling the king to project authority across a geographically dispersed and culturally heterogeneous empire. This administrative sophistication was reinforced by a codified legal system, which emphasized restitution, proportionality, and the integration of divine sanction into human governance, reflecting the Hittite understanding that social stability, political authority, and cosmic order were inseparable, and that kingship was not merely a political office but a sacred duty requiring ritual, judgment, and protection of the social and cosmic balance. Kingship was thus conceived as a mediatory role, with rulers acting as intermediaries between gods and people, conducting rituals, interpreting omens, adjudicating disputes, and ensuring the enforcement of treaties, while religious practice provided a unifying framework that integrated local cults and deities into the imperial pantheon to promote loyalty and social cohesion. Militarily, the Hittites combined chariotry, infantry, and auxiliary forces drawn from subject populations, employing strategic fortifications, urban planning, and garrison settlements to secure borders, conduct campaigns, and symbolize authority, demonstrating a sophisticated understanding of both tactical flexibility and strategic logistics. Fortified cities and administrative centers not only functioned as defensive strongholds but also communicated the reach and presence of imperial power across the landscape. Diplomacy complemented military strength, forming a central component of Hittite statecraft, as kings engaged in treaties, correspondence, and marriage alliances with Egypt, Assyria, Mitanni, and Babylonia, employing formalized oaths and invoking divine witnesses to ensure compliance and facilitate the regulation of interstate relations. The peace treaty between Hattusili III and Ramses II exemplifies this approach, blending cessation of hostilities with reciprocal obligations, dynastic marriages, and long-term agreements, illustrating the Hittites' capacity to achieve durable political solutions through negotiation as well as coercion. Economic control further reinforced imperial authority, with management of metals, timber, luxury goods, and agricultural surpluses underpinning trade, sustaining urban centers, funding military campaigns, and securing loyalty from vassals and allied states. Cultural policy and artistic production reflected both imperial ideology and regional integration, as monumental reliefs, palace decorations, inscriptions, and ritual texts blended Anatolian, Hurrian, and Mesopotamian influences, creating a visual and intellectual language that communicated royal legitimacy, divine favor, and historical memory. Mythological and ritual texts explored themes of kingship, morality, succession, and cosmic order, linking theology with political practice and providing a framework through which rulers and subjects interpreted events, decisions, and social obligations. Despite these achievements, the Hittite Empire faced significant structural vulnerabilities. Dependence on vassal loyalty, centralized administration, and long supply chains made the empire susceptible to environmental stress, resource shortages, and internal dissent, while rising external powers such as Assyria, fluctuating Egyptian influence, and the incursions of migratory groups, including the Sea Peoples, imposed additional pressures. Internal palace intrigue, succession disputes, and regional revolts further undermined cohesion, demonstrating the delicate balance between central authority and delegated control. By the early 12th century BCE, these cumulative pressures led to the abandonment of Hattusa and the fragmentation of the empire into smaller Neo-Hittite states, which preserved Hittite cultural, religious, and administrative practices while adapting to new political realities. These successor polities, primarily located in northern Syria and southeastern Anatolia, continued to use hieroglyphic Luwian inscriptions, monumental reliefs, dynastic titles, and ritual practices, asserting legitimacy through inherited ideological frameworks while integrating local traditions and responding to the post-imperial geopolitical environment. Legal and administrative systems, including property regulation, taxation, and vassal obligations, persisted, highlighting the durability of institutional memory, while fortifications, urban layouts, and ceremonial centers reinforced authority and social cohesion. Hittite influence extended far beyond the immediate aftermath of collapse, shaping neighboring civilizations such as Assyria and Babylonia, which adopted and adapted aspects of Hittite legal, diplomatic, and artistic practices, while religious iconography, monumental styles, and ceremonial traditions informed the cultural vocabulary of Anatolia and Syria. Archaeological evidence, from the monumental gates and temples of Hattusa to open-air sanctuaries like Yazilikiya and Neo-Hittite reliefs, demonstrates sophisticated urban planning, symbolic integration of political and religious spaces, and deliberate visual communication of authority. Linguistically, Hittite texts have provided critical insights into early Indo-European languages, revealing archaic forms and contributing to the understanding of linguistic development and cross-cultural interaction across Eurasia. Modern scholarship recognizes that the significance of the Hittite Empire lies not only in military conquest or territorial expansion but in the integration of law, governance, diplomacy, religion, and culture into a coherent system that facilitated stability, cohesion, and influence. The Hittites exemplify both the potential and limits of complex statecraft, illustrating how centralized authority, delegation, cultural synthesis, and ritual legitimacy can sustain an empire, while also highlighting the vulnerabilities of such systems to environmental, economic, social, and geopolitical stress. The Neo-Hittite states, in preserving and adapting the cultural, administrative, and religious legacies of the empire, demonstrate the persistence of identity, institutional knowledge, and political ideology beyond the collapse of central authority, showing that influence can endure through adaptation, continuity, and transmission. The Hittite Empire's trajectory provides a paradigm for understanding resilience, collapse, and legacy in human societies, emphasizing the interdependence of military organization, legal and administrative innovation, religious authority, economic strategy, and diplomatic skill in sustaining power and cohesion. Its history underscores the negotiation between centralization and regional autonomy, coercion and accommodation, and tradition and adaptation, offering lessons on governance, cultural integration, and the transmission of knowledge. Ultimately, the Hittites' achievements in law, ritual, diplomacy, art, architecture, and language created a civilization whose impact transcended its temporal and geographic boundaries, influencing successor states, neighboring powers, and the intellectual and cultural memory of the Near East for centuries. The rise, consolidation, administration, and eventual disintegration of the Hittite Empire provide a comprehensive case study in the construction, maintenance, and adaptation of complex political systems, illustrating the enduring power of ideas, institutions, and cultural identity to shape history. Through its integration of military, administrative, legal, religious, and diplomatic strategies, the Hittites created a model of governance whose influence persisted beyond the fall of Hattusa, guiding successor polities, inspiring neighboring civilizations, and leaving an enduring legacy that continues to illuminate the organization, resilience, and cultural sophistication of ancient human societies. The Hittite Empire, in its full historical scope, represents a remarkable example of a Bronze Age civilization that successfully merged military innovation, administrative sophistication, legal codification, religious integration, and diplomatic acumen to construct a state capable of exerting influence across Anatolia, northern Syria, and parts of Mesopotamia, yet one that ultimately faced the intrinsic vulnerabilities of complex, multi-ethnic, and geographically dispersed societies, and whose legacy provides enduring lessons on the durability of culture, institutions, and ideas even after political collapse. From its early consolidation under kings such as Labarna, Hattusili I, and Mursili I, the Hittites developed a centralized administrative system that delegated authority to regional governors, military commanders, and scribes, allowing for effective oversight of vassal territories, collection of tribute, enforcement of laws, and coordination of military campaigns, while simultaneously projecting the king's presence and authority across a broad and culturally diverse empire. Central to this governance was a codified legal system emphasizing restitution, proportionality, and divine sanction, demonstrating the Hittite understanding that social stability and political legitimacy were inseparable from moral and cosmic order, and that kingship itself was a sacred office requiring ritual observance, adjudication, and the protection of both human and divine obligations. Hittite religion played a pivotal role in governance, integrating local cults and foreign deities into the imperial pantheon, reinforcing loyalty among diverse populations, and legitimizing the authority of the king through ritualized interaction with the divine, including ceremonies, divination, and oath-taking, which underscored the inseparability of politics and religion in maintaining societal cohesion. Militarily, the Hittites combined highly trained chariotry, infantry units, and auxiliary forces from subject populations, employing strategic fortifications, urban planning, and garrison settlements to secure borders, conduct campaigns, and communicate the presence of imperial power. The use of fortified cities, defensive walls, and strategically placed strongholds not only enhanced military security but also served as tangible symbols of authority, reinforcing the empire's control over conquered or allied territories. Diplomacy functioned as a complementary instrument of power, as Hittite kings engaged in formalized treaties, marriage alliances, and extensive correspondence with Egypt, Assyria, Mitanni, and Babylonia, often invoking divine witnesses to ensure compliance, regulate obligations, and mediate disputes, exemplified by the historic treaty between Hattusili III and Ramses II, which combined cessation of hostilities with dynastic marriages and mutual defense agreements, demonstrating the Hittites' capacity for sustained negotiation and strategic planning. Economic management was integral to imperial stability, as control over metals, timber, grain, and luxury goods enabled the Hittites to sustain urban centers, support military operations, secure loyalty from vassals, and exert influence over regional trade networks, reflecting the interconnectedness of economic, military, and political power in sustaining complex states. Cultural policies further reinforced cohesion and legitimacy, as the Hittites synthesized Anatolian, Hurrian, and Mesopotamian artistic and literary traditions into monumental reliefs, palace decoration, inscriptions, and ritual texts that conveyed narratives of kingship, divine favor, and historical memory, while mythological and ritual literature explored themes of morality, succession, and the maintenance of cosmic and social order, linking theological reflection with political authority and societal expectations. Despite these achievements, the Hittite Empire faced structural vulnerabilities inherent in the administration of a large, multi-ethnic, and geographically dispersed state. Dependence on vassal loyalty, extended supply chains, and centralized coordination exposed the empire to internal and external shocks, while environmental fluctuations, agricultural shortfalls, and resource scarcity could strain both urban and military infrastructures. External pressures from rising Assyria, shifting Egyptian influence, and the incursions of migratory groups such as the Sea Peoples, combined with internal palace intrigue, succession disputes, and localized rebellions, contributed to political instability and the eventual collapse of centralized authority by the early 12th century BCE, culminating in the abandonment of Hattusa and the fragmentation of the empire. In the aftermath, Neo-Hittite states emerged across northern Syria and southeastern Anatolia, preserving the cultural, religious, and administrative frameworks of the empire while adapting to smaller territorial and political realities. These successor polities maintained hieroglyphic Luwian inscriptions, monumental reliefs, dynastic titles, and ritual practices, asserting legitimacy through inherited ideological models while integrating local traditions and responding pragmatically to the changed geopolitical landscape. Legal and administrative practices, including property regulation, taxation, and vassal obligations, persisted, demonstrating the resilience of institutional memory, while urban planning, fortifications, and ceremonial centers reinforced authority, symbolized continuity, and promoted social cohesion. The influence of the Hittites extended far beyond the immediate post-collapse period, shaping Assyrian, Babylonian, and later Iron Age practices in law, diplomacy, and art, while Hittite religious iconography, monumental forms, and ceremonial traditions continued to inform the cultural and visual vocabulary of the region. Archaeological evidence, from the monumental gates, temples, and palaces of Hattusa to the rock sanctuaries at Yazilikaya and the reliefs of Neo-Hittite centers, illustrates the integration of religious and political spaces, the deliberate communication of authority, and sophisticated urban and ceremonial planning. Linguistically, Hittite texts provide critical insights into early Indo-European languages, revealing archaic grammatical forms, cross-cultural borrowings, and the diffusion of administrative and diplomatic vocabulary, thereby enriching modern understanding of language evolution and intercultural interaction in the ancient Near East. Modern scholarship increasingly recognizes that the Hittite Empire's significance lies not only in military conquest or territorial extent but in its integrated systems of governance, law, diplomacy, religion, and culture, which sustained social cohesion and regional influence over centuries. The Hittites exemplify the potential and limits of complex states, showing how centralization, delegated authority, cultural synthesis, and ritual legitimacy can create durable empires, while also revealing the vulnerabilities of such systems to environmental, economic, social, and geopolitical pressures. The Neo-Hittite polities illustrate the persistence of Hittite cultural identity, institutional knowledge, and political ideology beyond the collapse of central authority, demonstrating that influence can endure through continuity, adaptation, and the transmission of ideas. The history of the Hittite Empire provides a paradigm for understanding resilience, collapse, and legacy in human societies, emphasizing the interdependence of military organization, legal and administrative innovation, religious authority, economic strategy, and diplomatic skill in maintaining complex political systems. Its trajectory underscores the negotiation between centralization and regional autonomy, coercion and accommodation, and tradition and adaptation, offering enduring lessons on governance, cultural integration, and the preservation of knowledge. Ultimately, the Hittites' achievements in law, ritual, diplomacy, art, architecture, and language created a civilization whose impact transcended its temporal and geographic boundaries, influencing successor states, neighboring powers, and the intellectual and cultural memory of the Near East for centuries. The rise, consolidation, administration, and eventual disintegration of the Hittite Empire provide a comprehensive model of how human societies can organize, govern, and sustain influence while navigating complexity and instability, demonstrating that the ideas, institutions, and cultural innovations of a civilization can persist and shape history long after its political structures have fallen. Through its integration of military, administrative, legal, religious, and diplomatic strategies, the Hittite Empire created a model of governance whose legacy endured beyond the fall of Hattusa, guiding successor polities, influencing regional powers, and leaving an indelible mark on the cultural and historical landscape of the ancient Near East, illustrating the enduring power of civilization to shape the trajectory of human history. The Hittite Empire, one of the most influential and sophisticated civilizations of the Late Bronze Age, exemplifies how a polity situated at the intersection of Anatolia, northern Syria, and Mesopotamia could develop a complex and integrated system of governance, military organization, legal codification, religious practice, and diplomatic engagement to sustain a multi-ethnic and geographically dispersed empire while navigating both internal and external pressures, and its legacy provides profound insights into the endurance of institutions, culture, and ideas beyond political collapse. From the early consolidation of Hattusa as a central capital under rulers such as Labarna, Hattusili I, and Mursalai I, the Hittites constructed an administrative apparatus that combined centralized royal authority with delegated regional control, appointing governors, military commanders, and scribes to oversee vassal territories, collect tribute, administer justice, and coordinate civil and military resources, thereby enabling the king to exercise authority over a diverse empire that encompassed mountainous Anatolia, fertile river valleys, and contested Syrian frontiers. Central to this governance was a codified legal system that emphasized restitution, proportionality, and the integration of divine sanction, reflecting the Hittite understanding that political legitimacy, social stability, and cosmic order were inseparable, and that kingship was a sacred office responsible not only for human law but also for maintaining harmony between humans and gods. Kings performed religious and judicial duties as a means of asserting authority, conducting ritual ceremonies, interpreting omens, and adjudicating disputes, while religious practice provided a framework for integrating local cults and foreign deities into the imperial pantheon, fostering loyalty and social cohesion across ethnically and culturally diverse populations. The Hittite military was highly organized and strategically sophisticated, combining chariot units, infantry, and auxiliary forces drawn from subject populations, supported by fortified cities, urban planning, and garrison settlements that secured borders, enabled offensive campaigns, and projected imperial presence across the landscape. Fortifications and strategically located settlements not only provided practical defense but also served as symbolic representations of Hittite authority and control. Diplomacy complemented military might, forming a central pillar of Hittite statecraft, as kings negotiated treaties, marital alliances, and written agreements with Egypt, Assyria, Mitanni, and Babylonia, often invoking divine witnesses to legitimize obligations and mediate disputes, with the treaty between Hattusili III and Ramses II serving as a prime example of long-term strategic negotiation, incorporating cessation of hostilities, mutual defense clauses, and dynastic marriages. Economic strategy reinforced political and military stability, with control over metals, timber, agricultural surpluses, and luxury goods enabling trade, sustaining urban centers, funding military campaigns, and ensuring the loyalty of vassals and allies, demonstrating the integration of economic resources into a broader system of governance and power projection. Cultural and artistic production played a significant role in consolidating imperial authority and identity, as the Hittites synthesized Anatolian, Hurrian, and Mesopotamian motifs to create monumental reliefs, palace decorations, inscriptions, and ritual texts that communicated political ideology, divine favor, and historical memory, while mythological and ritual literature explored themes of kingship, morality, succession, and cosmic order, linking theology with governance and providing a framework through which rulers and subjects interpreted events and social obligations. Despite these strengths, the Hittite Empire faced vulnerabilities inherent to the administration of a complex, multi-ethnic, and geographically dispersed state. Dependence on vassal loyalty, long supply lines, and centralized coordination made the empire susceptible to internal disruption, while environmental fluctuations, resource shortages, and agricultural challenges strained urban centers and military logistics. External pressures from rising Assyria, fluctuating Egyptian influence, and migratory groups such as the Sea Peoples, coupled with internal palace intrigue, succession disputes, and regional revolts, contributed to political instability and the eventual collapse of centralized authority by the early 12th century BCE, culminating in the abandonment of Hattusa and the fragmentation of the empire into smaller Neo-Hittite polities. These successor states, scattered across northern Syria and southeastern Anatolia, preserved Hittite cultural, religious, and administrative frameworks while adapting to the political realities of smaller territories and local autonomy. They maintained hieroglyphic Luwian inscriptions, monumental reliefs, dynastic titles, and ritual practices, asserting legitimacy through inherited ideological structures while incorporating regional traditions and pragmatically responding to the post-imperial landscape. Legal and administrative systems, including property regulation, taxation, and vassal obligations, continued to function, illustrating the resilience of institutional memory, while urban planning, fortifications, and ceremonial centers reinforced social cohesion and symbolized continuity. The influence of the Hittites extended beyond their immediate successors, affecting Assyrian and Babylonian legal, diplomatic, and artistic practices, and contributing to the broader cultural vocabulary of the Near East through monumental architecture, religious iconography, and ceremonial traditions. Archaeological evidence, from the gates, temples, and palaces of Hattusa to the rock sanctuaries of Yazilikiah and Neo-Hittite reliefs, illustrates the integration of religious and political spaces, the deliberate communication of authority, and sophisticated urban and ceremonial planning. Linguistic studies of Hittite texts have provided critical insight into early Indo-European languages, revealing archaic forms, administrative terminology, and cross-cultural borrowings, thereby contributing to modern understanding of language evolution, cultural exchange, and the diffusion of ideas across Eurasia. Scholars today recognize that the significance of the Hittite Empire lies not merely in military conquest or territorial expansion but in the integration of law, governance, diplomacy, religion, and culture into a system that sustained cohesion, projected influence, and facilitated resilience over centuries. The Hittites exemplify both the potential and limitations of complex states, demonstrating how centralization, delegation, cultural synthesis, and ritual legitimacy can sustain a multi-ethnic empire, while also highlighting the vulnerabilities of such systems to environmental, economic, social, and geopolitical pressures. The Neo-Hittite polities illustrate the persistence of cultural identity, institutional knowledge, and political ideology beyond the collapse of centralized authority, showing that influence can endure through adaptation, continuity, and transmission. The Hittite Empire provides a paradigm for understanding resilience, collapse, and legacy in human societies, emphasizing the interdependence of military organization, administrative innovation, legal and ritual authority, economic strategy, and diplomacy in sustaining complex political systems. Its history underscores the negotiation between centralization and regional autonomy, coercion and accommodation, tradition and adaptation, offering enduring lessons on governance, cultural integration, and the transmission of knowledge. Ultimately, the Hittites' achievements in law, ritual, diplomacy, art, architecture, and language created a civilization whose influence transcended its temporal and geographic boundaries, shaping successor states, neighboring powers, and the intellectual and cultural memory of the Near East for centuries. The rise, consolidation, administration, and eventual disintegration of the Hittite Empire provide a comprehensive case study in the construction, maintenance, and adaptation of complex political systems, demonstrating how ideas, institutions, and culture can persist long after political structures have vanished. Through its integration of military, administrative, legal, religious, economic, and diplomatic strategies, the Hittite Empire created a model of governance whose legacy endured well beyond the fall of Hattusa, guiding successor states, influencing neighboring civilizations, and leaving an indelible mark on the historical and cultural landscape of the ancient Near East, illustrating the enduring power and significance of civilization in human history. The Hittite Empire, one of the most influential and enduring civilizations of the Late Bronze Age, demonstrates the remarkable capacity of a society at the crossroads of Anatolia, northern Syria, and Mesopotamia to develop a sophisticated and multifaceted system of governance, military organization, legal codification, religious integration, and diplomatic strategy, allowing it to exert control over a diverse and geographically dispersed population while navigating the constant pressures of internal challenges and external threats, and its legacy provides an extraordinary lens through which to understand the persistence of institutions, culture, and ideas beyond the lifespan of a political entity. From the earliest establishment of Hattusa as a centralized capital under rulers such as Labarna, Hattusili I, and Mursili I, the Hittites built an administrative apparatus that combined concentrated royal authority with delegated regional governance, appointing governors, military commanders, and scribes to oversee vassal territories, collect tribute, administer justice, and coordinate resources for civil administration and military campaigns, thereby enabling the king to maintain control over a vast and culturally heterogeneous empire that included Anatolia's mountainous regions, fertile river valleys, and contested Syrian frontier zones. Central to this system was a codified legal framework emphasizing restitution, proportionality, and divine sanction, reflecting the Hittite understanding that political legitimacy, social stability, and cosmic order were inseparably linked, and that kingship represented a sacred office charged with upholding both human and divine obligations. Hittite kings exercised authority as mediators between gods and mortals, performing ritual ceremonies, interpreting omens, adjudicating disputes, and ensuring the enforcement of treaties, while religion functioned as a unifying force that incorporated local cults and deities into the imperial pantheon to encourage loyalty, mitigate resistance, and sustain social cohesion across ethnically diverse populations. Militarily, the Hittites demonstrated exceptional organization and strategic awareness, combining chariotry, infantry, and auxiliary units from subject populations with fortified settlements, urban planning, and strategically located garrisons to secure borders, conduct offensive campaigns, and project imperial authority, with fortifications and strongholds serving both practical defensive functions and symbolic demonstrations of state power. Diplomacy was equally central to Hittite strategy, as kings negotiated treaties, marriage alliances, and formal correspondence with neighboring powers such as Egypt, Assyria, Mitanni, and Babylonia, often invoking divine witnesses to legitimize agreements and enforce compliance, exemplified by the treaty between Hattusili III and Ramses II, which blended cessation of hostilities with dynastic marriages and mutual defense clauses, highlighting the empire's capacity for long-term political negotiation alongside military action. Economic control underpinned the empire's stability, with oversight of metals, timber, grain, and luxury goods sustaining urban centers, funding armies, facilitating trade networks, and ensuring vassal loyalty, demonstrating the interdependence of economic resources, military power, and political authority. Cultural production served as both a reflection of and a mechanism for consolidating imperial authority, as the Hittites synthesized Anatolian, Hurrian, and Mesopotamian artistic and literary traditions into monumental reliefs, palace decorations, inscriptions, and ritual texts that conveyed narratives of kingship, divine favor, and historical memory, while mythological and ritual literature addressed themes of morality, succession, cosmic order, and human-divine interaction, linking theology with governance and shaping societal norms. Despite these accomplishments, the Hittite Empire faced structural vulnerabilities common to complex, multi-ethnic states. Dependence on vassal loyalty, centralized administration, and extended supply chains made the empire susceptible to internal unrest, while environmental pressures, resource scarcity, and agricultural shortfalls strained urban centers and military logistics. External threats, including the expansion of Assyria, fluctuating Egyptian influence, and incursions by migratory groups such as the Sea Peoples, compounded by palace intrigue, succession disputes, and regional revolts, destabilized centralized authority and contributed to the eventual collapse of Hattusa as a political center in the early 12th century BCE, leading to fragmentation into smaller Neo-Hittite polities. These successor states, located primarily in northern Syria and southeastern Anatolia, preserved Hittite cultural, religious, and administrative traditions while adapting to smaller territorial scales, regional autonomy, and changing geopolitical realities. They maintained hieroglyphic Luwian inscriptions, monumental reliefs, dynastic titles, and ritual practices, asserting legitimacy through inherited ideological frameworks while integrating local cultural practices and pragmatically responding to new political landscapes. Legal and administrative practices, including property regulation, taxation, and vassal obligations, continued to function, demonstrating the durability of institutional memory, while urban planning, fortifications, and ceremonial centers reinforced social cohesion and symbolized continuity. The cultural and political influence of the Hittites extended far beyond the immediate post-collapse period, shaping Assyrian, Babylonian, and later Iron Age legal, diplomatic, and artistic practices, while Hittite monumental architecture, religious iconography, and ceremonial traditions contributed to the broader visual and ideological vocabulary of the Near East. Archaeological evidence, ranging from the monumental gates, temples, and palaces of Hattusa to the open-air sanctuaries at Yazilakaya and the reliefs of Neo-Hittite centers, reveals a sophisticated integration of religious and political spaces, deliberate visual communication of authority, and advanced urban and ceremonial planning. Linguistically, Hittite texts provide crucial insight into early Indo-European languages, offering evidence of archaic grammatical forms, administrative terminology, and cross-cultural borrowings, which contribute to modern understanding of language development, intercultural exchange, and the diffusion of ideas across Eurasia. Contemporary scholarship increasingly recognizes that the significance of the Hittite Empire lies not only in its military conquests or territorial extent but in its integrated systems of law, governance, diplomacy, religion, and culture, which sustained social cohesion, projected influence, and facilitated resilience over centuries. The Hittites exemplify the potential and limitations of complex states, showing how centralization, delegation, cultural synthesis, and ritual legitimacy can maintain multi-ethnic empires while revealing vulnerabilities to environmental, economic, social, and geopolitical stresses. The Neo-Hittite polities highlight the persistence of Hittite identity, institutional knowledge, and political ideology beyond the collapse of central authority, demonstrating that influence endures through continuity, adaptation, and cultural transmission. The Hittite Empire provides a paradigm for examining resilience, collapse, and legacy in human societies, emphasizing the interdependence of military organization, administrative innovation, legal and ritual authority, economic strategy, and diplomacy in sustaining complex political systems. Its history underscores the negotiation between centralization and regional autonomy, coercion and accommodation, and tradition and adaptation, offering enduring lessons on governance, cultural integration, and the transmission of knowledge. Ultimately, the Hittites' accomplishments in law, ritual, diplomacy, art, architecture, and language created a civilization whose influence transcended temporal and geographic boundaries, shaping successor states, neighboring powers, and the intellectual and cultural memory of the Near East for centuries. The rise, consolidation, administration, and eventual disintegration of the Hittite Empire provide a comprehensive case study in the construction, maintenance, and adaptation of complex political systems, illustrating how ideas, institutions, and culture can persist long after political structures have disappeared. Through its integration of military, administrative, legal, religious, economic, and diplomatic strategies, the Hittite Empire established a model of governance whose legacy endured beyond the fall of Hattusa, guiding successor polities, influencing neighboring civilizations, and leaving an indelible mark on the historical and cultural landscape of the ancient Near East, demonstrating the enduring power and significance of civilization in human history.